The high-altitude valley of Cusco, nestled at 11,200 feet above sea level in the eastern Cordillera of the Andes, witnessed the emergence of what would become the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. Archaeological evidence suggests human occupation in this strategic valley dates back several millennia, but the specific origins of the people who would call themselves the Inca remain shrouded in both legend and scholarly debate. The term Inca itself originally referred only to the ruling elite and the emperor, while the broader population identified as Runa, meaning people in Quechua. According to the most widely preserved foundation myth, recorded by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, the sun god Inti sent his children Manco Capac and Mama Ocolo to emerge from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca. These divine siblings, who were also husband and wife following Andean royal tradition, carried with them a golden staff and instructions to establish a city where the staff would sink completely into the earth upon striking the ground. After wandering northward through the Altiplano, they reached the fertile Cusco Valley, where the golden staff disappeared into the soil near the hill of Huayna, indicating the chosen location for their capital. Alternative versions of the origin story, particularly those recorded by chronicler Juan de Betanzos, describe Manco Capac leading a group of 10 Ailu, or kinship groups, from caves at Pachakuti, roughly 15 miles south of Cusco. These Tambo Toco caves, meaning lodge with windows, allegedly housed 3 groups of people, with Manco Capac and his siblings emerging from the central cave called Capac Toco. This version emphasizes the collective nature of the founding, with Manco Capac serving as the leader of a confederation rather than a divine individual. Archaeological investigations in the Cusco Valley have revealed a more complex picture of early settlement patterns. Radiocarbon dating of ceramic fragments and architectural remains indicates continuous occupation by various groups from approximately 1000 AD onward. The Quilca culture, identified through distinctive pottery styles and construction techniques, appears to have dominated the valley between 900 and 1200 AD, predating the rise of Inca political power. These pre-Inca inhabitants established terraced agricultural systems on the valley slopes and constructed stone foundations that would later support Inca monumental architecture. The transition from the semi-mythical kingdom of Cusco to a recognizable political entity capable of imperial expansion occurred gradually between 1200 and 1400 AD. Early Inca rulers, known as Sapa Incas, consolidated power among the various Quechua-speaking communities scattered throughout the Cusco Valley and surrounding highlands. This process involved both military conquest and strategic marriage alliances with local Curaca, or ethnic leaders, who controlled access to agricultural lands and labour forces. The first historically verifiable Sapa Inca, Manco Capac, likely ruled during the early 13th century, though distinguishing historical fact from mythological elaboration remains challenging. Spanish chroniclers, working from oral traditions recorded decades after the conquest, attributed supernatural powers and impossibly long reigns to early rulers. More reliable evidence suggests that Manco Capac established the basic framework of Inca political organization, including the division of Cusco into upper and lower moieties, known as Hanan and Hurin, which reflected broader Andean concepts of complementary dualism. Sinchi Roca, traditionally considered the second Sapa Inca, expanded Inca influence beyond the immediate Cusco Valley through diplomatic marriages and limited military campaigns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Chocapuquio and Piquilacta suggests that early Inca expansion involved absorbing existing population centres rather than displacing them entirely. The Inca demonstrated remarkable pragmatism in incorporating local religious practices and administrative structures while gradually imposing their own political hierarchy. The development of fundamental Inca institutions during this formative period reflected sophisticated understanding of Andean social organization and environmental challenges. The Ailu system, which formed the basic unit of Inca society, represented an adaptation of pre-existing kinship structures found throughout the Andes. Each Ailu claimed descent from a common ancestor, often associated with specific geographical features like mountains, springs, or caves considered sacred. These kinship groups controlled access to agricultural land, maintained collective work obligations, and preserved oral traditions linking them to the cosmic order. Within the Ailu framework, the Inca developed the Mita system of labour obligations that would become central to imperial administration. Mita required all adult males to contribute a specific amount of labour annually to community projects, religious ceremonies, and state enterprises. This system built upon traditional Andean practices of collective work for mutual benefit, but the Inca systematized and expanded it to support large-scale construction projects and military campaigns. Archaeological evidence from early Inca sites reveals sophisticated coordination of labour gangs working on agricultural terraces, irrigation channels, and ceremonial structures. The concept of aini, or reciprocity, provided the ideological foundation for these labour obligations and broader social relationships. Aini operated at multiple levels, from individual exchanges of goods and services to cosmic relationships between humans and supernatural forces. The Sapa Inca positioned himself as the ultimate reciprocal partner, receiving labour and tribute from his subjects while providing protection, agricultural surplus distribution during famines, and access to exotic goods from distant regions. This system differed fundamentally from European feudalism, as it emphasized mutual obligation rather than hierarchical domination. Religious practices during the early Inca period centered on the worship of Inti, the sun god, while incorporating numerous local deities and sacred sites known as Huayna. The Inca demonstrated remarkable tolerance for local religious traditions, often identifying foreign deities with their own pantheon, rather than suppressing them entirely. This syncretic approach facilitated the integration of conquered peoples and reduced resistance to Inca rule. The Coricancha, or Golden Enclosure, in Cusco, served as the primary temple complex, though its most elaborate construction occurred during later imperial expansion. Early territorial expansion under the first Sapa Incas focused primarily on securing control over the Cusco Valley and establishing dominance over neighbouring ethnic groups. Loke Yupanqui, the third traditional ruler, allegedly extended Inca influence southward toward Lake Titicaca, though archaeological evidence for specific military campaigns remains limited. The conquest of the Cajamarca people, who controlled territory northwest of Cusco, represented a significant early expansion that brought additional agricultural land and labour under Inca control. Maita Capac, the fourth Sapa Inca, initiated more aggressive expansion policies that established patterns followed by later imperial rulers. His campaigns against the Alcabissa and other groups in the Apurimac Valley demonstrated Inca military capabilities and introduced the practice of relocating conquered populations to prevent rebellion. These early conquests also reveal the importance of controlling strategic mountain passes and river valleys that facilitated trade and communication between highland and lowland regions. The establishment of Cusco as both political and religious centre required massive construction projects that transformed the valley's landscape. The Inca drained marshy areas, redirected rivers, and constructed elaborate stone foundations for temples and palaces. The precision of Inca stonework, characterized by perfectly fitted blocks requiring no mortar, developed during this early period through experimentation with local building materials and techniques inherited from the Quilqué culture. The famous 12-angled stone in Cusco's Hatun Rumiyok Street demonstrates the sophisticated engineering skills that would later enable construction of Machu Picchu and other architectural marvels. Capac Yupanqui, the fifth Sapa Inca, consolidated earlier conquests while extending Inca influence eastward into the cloud forests of the Antisuyu region. These campaigns brought the Inca into contact with different ecological zones and exotic products like coca leaves, tropical fruits, and colourful feathers used in religious ceremonies. The integration of multiple ecological zones, known as vertical archipelago, became a defining characteristic of Inca economic strategy, allowing the empire to achieve remarkable agricultural diversity and food security. The reign of Inca Roca, the sixth traditional ruler, marked a crucial transition toward more systematic imperial administration. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, the Inca began implementing standardized architectural styles, pottery traditions, and administrative practices across their expanding territory. The construction of storage facilities, known as kolka, enabled the accumulation of agricultural surpluses that supported non-agricultural specialists, including craftsmen, priests, and military personnel. Yahuahuacac, whose name translates as "he who weeps blood," ruled during a period of internal conflict and external pressure from neighbouring confederations. Traditional accounts describe his temporary exile from Cusco and subsequent return with military support from allied ethnic groups. This episode illustrates the precarious nature of early Inca power and the importance of maintaining reciprocal relationships with local leaders. The resolution of this crisis strengthened Inca political institutions and demonstrated the effectiveness of their alliance-building strategies. Viracocha Inca, the eighth traditional ruler, faced the greatest external threat to early Inca expansion in the form of the Chanca Confederation, based in the Andahuaylas region west of Cusco. The Chanca had established their own expanding polity and viewed the Inca as rivals for regional dominance. Traditional accounts describe a climactic battle in which the Inca barely survived a Chanca assault on Cusco itself, with victory attributed to divine intervention and the military genius of Viracocha's son, the future Pachakuti Inca Yupanqui. The defeat of the Chanca Confederation around 1438 AD marked the end of the formative period and the beginning of true imperial expansion. This victory demonstrated Inca military superiority over their most dangerous rivals and opened the way for conquest of the entire Central Andes. The psychological impact of defeating the Chanca cannot be overstated, as it established the Inca as the dominant power in the region and attracted voluntary submission from many smaller ethnic groups who preferred alliance to conquest. The administrative innovations developed during the early period provided the foundation for managing a vast empire spanning multiple ecological zones and ethnic groups. The decimal system of organization, which divided populations into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 households, enabled efficient tax collection and labour mobilization. Local Curaca retained authority over their communities while accepting Inca oversight and tribute obligations. This indirect rule system minimized administrative costs while maintaining effective control over distant territories. The victory over the Chanca Confederation transformed not merely the political landscape of the Central Andes, but fundamentally altered the trajectory of Inca civilization. The prince who had become Pachakuti Inca, Yupanqui, had demonstrated exceptional military leadership during the crisis, reportedly rallying demoralized Inca forces when his father, Viracocha Inca, considered abandoning Cusco entirely. Contemporary accounts describe how the young prince convinced local Alus to stand firm against the Chanca advance, promising that supernatural forces would aid their defence. When Chanca warriors approached the outskirts of Cusco around 1438 AD, they encountered not the scattered resistance they expected, but a coordinated defence that ultimately drove them back toward their Andahuaylas stronghold. The aftermath of this pivotal battle revealed the depth of Pachacuti's strategic vision. Rather than simply celebrating victory, he immediately began implementing revolutionary changes that would reshape Inca society from its foundations. His first major decision involved forcibly retiring his father Viracocha Inca and assuming direct control over the expanding state. This unprecedented action violated traditional succession practices, but demonstrated Pachacuti's understanding that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. the new Sapa Inca surrounded himself with advisors drawn from multiple ethnic groups, including former Chanca leaders who had demonstrated exceptional military or administrative skills. Pachacuti's military reforms began with a complete reorganization of Inca armed forces, transforming them from a collection of Ayllu-based militias into a professional army capable of sustained campaigns across diverse terrain. The traditional Inca military had relied primarily on slings, clubs, and bronze-tipped spears, weapons well suited for highland warfare, but limited in their effectiveness against heavily fortified settlements or disciplined enemy formations. Pachakuti introduced standardized weapons production, establishing workshops in Cusco, where skilled craftsmen manufactured uniform bronze axes, star-headed maces, and composite bows adapted from designs encountered during campaigns against eastern forest peoples. The restructuring of military organization reflected Pachacuti's broader administrative philosophy of combining traditional Andean practices with innovative, centralized control. He divided the army into decimal units following the household organization system, with groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors commanded by officers selected for demonstrated competence, rather than hereditary status alone. Each unit maintained its own supply train and medical personnel, enabling rapid deployment across the Empire's expanding frontiers. Specialized engineering corps accompanied major expeditions, tasked with constructing bridges, fortifications, and supply depots that facilitated military operations, while establishing permanent infrastructure for imperial administration. The conquest of the Chanca heartland required nearly 3 years of sustained campaigning across the rugged terrain between Cusco and Andahuaylas. Pachakuti personally led expeditions that systematically reduced Chanca fortresses, employing siege tactics that combined direct assault with psychological warfare designed to encourage surrender. The Inca army constructed elaborate earthworks around enemy positions, cutting off supply lines while maintaining constant pressure through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Archaeological excavations at sites like Sondor and Uranmaca reveal evidence of extensive Inca siege works, including stone platforms for catapults and carefully engineered approach trenches that protected attacking forces from defensive projectiles. The integration of conquered Chanca populations demonstrated Pachacuti's sophisticated understanding of imperial administration. Rather than eliminating potential sources of resistance, he implemented a comprehensive program of cultural assimilation that preserved local traditions while establishing clear Inca dominance. Chanca nobles who submitted voluntarily retained their positions within the imperial hierarchy, receiving new titles and responsibilities that bound them to the expanding state. Their children were brought to Cusco for education alongside Inca nobility, learning Quechua language and imperial customs while maintaining connections to their ancestral communities. Following the successful Chanca campaigns, Pachakuti initiated expansion into the Titicaca basin, targeting the powerful Colla and Lupaca confederations that controlled the Altiplano's extensive agricultural and pastoral resources. These high-altitude societies had developed sophisticated techniques for managing llama and alpaca herds while maintaining agricultural production in one of the world's harshest farming environments. The conquest of these groups required different military strategies than those employed against the Chanca, as Altiplano warfare favoured mobility over fortification, with battles often decided by the ability to control scattered water sources and grazing areas. The Colla Confederation presented particular challenges due to their extensive trade networks and diplomatic alliances with groups throughout the southern Andes. Pachakuti responded by combining military pressure with economic incentives, offering Colla leaders access to exotic goods from newly conquered territories in exchange for submission to Inca authority. The siege of the Colla capital at Hatuncola lasted several months, with Inca forces gradually tightening their control over surrounding agricultural areas while negotiating with faction leaders willing to abandon their allegiance to the Confederation's ruling dynasty. Pachakuti's expansion northward into the Yauja Valley and beyond brought the Inca into conflict with the sophisticated Huayna Confederation, whose territories controlled crucial mountain passes linking the central highlands with coastal regions. The Huayna had developed extensive terraced agriculture and maintained trade relationships with both highland and coastal societies, making their incorporation essential for Inca imperial ambitions. The conquest of Huayna territory required coordinated campaigns across multiple ecological zones, from high-altitude Puna grasslands to temperate valley floors where maize cultivation supported dense populations. The architectural transformation of Cusco under Pachakuti's direction represented perhaps his most visible and enduring achievement. The Sapa Inca ordered the complete reconstruction of the capital, replacing earlier structures with monumental stone buildings that reflected both Inca engineering capabilities and imperial ideology. The project required mobilizing thousands of workers from throughout the expanding empire, including skilled stonemasons, architects and labourers who spent decades reshaping the valley's landscape. The precision of Inca stonework reached its highest expression during this period, with massive granite blocks fitted so perfectly that no mortar was required and knife blades could not penetrate the joints between stones. The Coricancha, or golden enclosure, emerged as the spiritual and ceremonial centre of the reconstructed capital. This temple complex dedicated to Inti, the sun god, featured walls lined with sheets of beaten gold and housed the mummified remains of previous Sapa Incas, alongside sacred objects from throughout the empire. The main temple's interior contained a massive golden disc representing the sun, surrounded by smaller representations of celestial bodies and seasonal cycles that governed Inca agricultural and ceremonial calendars. Adjacent buildings housed priestesses dedicated to various deities, storage rooms for ceremonial objects, and workshops where skilled artisans created religious artifacts from precious metals and exotic materials. The construction of Sacsayhuaman Fortress overlooking Cusco demonstrated Pachakuti's commitment to defending his capital against future threats while creating a monument to Inca engineering prowess. This massive complex required moving limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons from quarries several miles away, a feat accomplished through coordinated human labour supplemented by bronze tools, wooden rollers and rope systems. The fortress's zigzag walls incorporated sophisticated defensive features, including overlapping fields of fire, hidden passages, and water storage systems that could sustain defenders during extended sieges. The establishment of the Ceque system represented Pachakuti's most innovative contribution to Inca religious and administrative organisation. This complex network of imaginary lines radiating outward from the Coricancha connected more than 300 sacred sites, or huacas, throughout the Cusco Valley and surrounding regions. Each Ceque was maintained by specific aylus responsible for conducting ceremonies, maintaining shrines, and preserving oral traditions associated with particular locations. The system served multiple functions simultaneously, organising religious obligations, defining territorial boundaries, and preserving historical memories that legitimised Inca rule over diverse populations. The decimal administrative system implemented throughout Pachakuti's expanding territories reflected his genius for adapting traditional Andean organisational principles to imperial requirements. The basic unit remained the household, but these were grouped into progressively larger administrative divisions overseen by appointed officials responsible to the Sapa Inca rather than local ethnic leaders. A Pachaca curator supervised 100 households, a Huaranca curator managed 1,000 households, and a Hunu curator controlled 10,000 households, with each level maintaining detailed records of population, agricultural production, and tribute obligations. The creation of provincial governors, known as Tucrico Apu, established direct imperial control over conquered territories while maintaining efficient communication between Cusco and distant regions. These governors, typically drawn from Inca nobility or thoroughly acculturated local elites, possessed broad authority over military, administrative, and religious affairs within their jurisdictions. They maintained permanent residences in provincial capitals equipped with storage facilities, administrative offices, and ceremonial spaces that replicated Cusco's layout on a smaller scale. Regular rotation of governors prevented the development of independent power bases while ensuring that imperial policies were implemented consistently across diverse ecological and cultural zones. The integration of the Mitama system of population resettlement became central to Pachakuti's strategy for managing ethnic diversity within the expanding empire. Entire communities were relocated from their ancestral territories to regions where their particular skills were needed, or where their presence would strengthen imperial control. Skilled craftsmen from conquered territories were brought to Cusco to work on imperial projects, while loyal populations were settled in recently conquered areas to serve as examples of proper imperial behaviour. These resettlements were conducted with careful attention to maintaining ecological adaptation, ensuring that highland peoples were not forced into lowland environments where they could not effectively contribute to imperial production. The expansion of the road system under Pachakuti's direction created the infrastructure necessary for effective imperial administration across the Andes' challenging terrain. Two main highways, the coastal and highland routes, connected distant provinces with the capital, while numerous secondary roads provided access to resource extraction sites, military installations, and ceremonial centres. The highland route required constructing bridges across deep gorges, cutting steps into cliff faces, and building retaining walls to prevent erosion during the rainy season. Suspension bridges woven from maguey fibre spanned rivers and chasms, maintained by local communities as part of their Mita obligations. The establishment of the Ceque messenger system enabled rapid communication across thousands of miles of imperial territory, with relay stations positioned at intervals that allowed trained runners to maintain constant movement of information between provincial centres and Cusco. These messengers, selected for their physical endurance and memorization skills, could traverse the empire's length in approximately 10 days, carrying verbal messages, small objects, and quipu records that documented administrative data. The system's efficiency depended on careful maintenance of roads, bridges, and supply stations that provided messengers with food, shelter, and replacement equipment during their journeys. The transformation of imperial ideology under Pachakuti elevated the Sapa Inca's status from regional leader to divine ruler, whose authority derived directly from Inti, the sun god. This ideological shift required extensive propaganda campaigns that spread throughout newly conquered territories, establishing Inca creation myths while incorporating local deities into an expanded imperial pantheon. The mummified remains of Pachakuti's predecessors were paraded during major ceremonies, demonstrating the continuity of divine authority while legitimizing the current ruler's policies through ancestral approval. The death of Pachakuti in 1471 AD marked not the end of Inca expansion, but its transformation into a systematic enterprise of unprecedented scale and sophistication. His son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, inherited an empire already spanning much of the central Andes, yet his reign would witness the most dramatic territorial expansion in Inca history, extending imperial control from present-day Colombia to central Chile. Unlike his father's campaigns, which focused primarily on consolidating power around Cusco and establishing administrative frameworks, Tupac Inca's military operations targeted sophisticated rival civilizations, whose conquest would require innovative strategies and unprecedented logistical coordination. The new Sapa Inca's first major campaign targeted the Chimu Empire along Peru's northern coast, a civilization that had dominated the region for over 4 centuries through mastery of desert agriculture, metallurgy, and textile production. the Chimu capital of Chan Chan, covering nearly 20 square kilometers, represented the largest pre-Columbian city in South America, its massive adobe walls protecting elaborate palace complexes, workshops, and ceremonial centers that housed an estimated 60,000 inhabitants. The city's sophisticated water management system channeled rivers through carefully engineered canals that irrigated extensive agricultural fields while supplying urban populations with fresh water, despite the surrounding desert environment. Chimu military organization differed fundamentally from highland Andean traditions, emphasizing naval warfare and desert mobility over the mountain tactics that had served the Inca well during their earlier conquests. Chimu warriors utilized balsa wood rafts capable of carrying substantial cargo loads along the coast, enabling rapid deployment of forces and supplies across their maritime territories. Their weapons included hardwood clubs embedded with bronze spikes, cotton armour reinforced with metal plates, and sophisticated projectile weapons adapted for coastal warfare conditions. Tupac Inca's campaign against the Chimu required developing entirely new military strategies suited to coastal desert conditions. The Inca army, accustomed to highland environments with reliable water sources and familiar terrain, faced the challenge of operating across waterless expanses where traditional supply methods proved inadequate. The Sapa Inca ordered the construction of massive storage facilities at strategic intervals along the coastal route, stockpiling food, water and military equipment transported from highland production centres via newly constructed roads that connected the Sierra with coastal valleys. The siege of Chan Chan demonstrated Tupac Inca's strategic brilliance and his ability to adapt highland military techniques to coastal conditions. Rather than attempting direct assault against the city's formidable defences, Inca forces systematically captured the irrigation systems that supplied Chan Chan's agricultural hinterland. Engineers diverted river channels, destroyed canal networks, and occupied water sources, gradually strangling the city's food supply while maintaining constant military pressure against its walls. Archaeological evidence from sites around Chan Chan reveals extensive Inca earthworks designed to control water flow and prevent Chimu forces from repairing damaged irrigation infrastructure. The psychological impact of controlling water resources proved as devastating as direct military action. Chimu farmers watched their carefully tended fields wither, while urban populations faced increasing shortages of both food and fresh water. Diplomatic missions from Chan Chan's rulers attempted to negotiate terms that would preserve Chimu autonomy while acknowledging Inca supremacy, but Tupac Inca demanded complete submission and integration into the imperial administrative system. After nearly 2 years of siege conditions, the Chimu Emperor Minchancaman surrendered his capital rather than witness the complete destruction of his civilization's agricultural foundation. The integration of Chimu territories into the Inca Empire represented a masterpiece of imperial administration that preserved valuable technical knowledge while establishing firm political control. Tupac Inca recognized that Chimu metallurgical expertise far exceeded Inca capabilities, particularly in the production of bronze alloys and decorative gold work that required sophisticated understanding of smelting temperatures and metal composition. Rather than disrupting these production systems, imperial administrators incorporated Chimu craftsmen into expanded workshops that combined traditional techniques with imperial design requirements. The most skilled Chimu metal workers were relocated to Cusco and other imperial centres, where they established workshops that produced ceremonial objects, weapons, and architectural elements for imperial construction projects. These craftsmen brought with them knowledge of advanced smelting techniques, including the use of wind-powered furnaces that achieved higher temperatures than traditional highland methods. The resulting improvements in Inca metallurgy enabled the production of larger bronze tools and weapons while reducing the labour requirements for metal production throughout the empire. Chimu textile production techniques proved equally valuable to imperial administrators, seeking to standardize clothing and ceremonial objects across diverse populations. Chimu weavers had developed sophisticated methods for producing fine cotton fabrics decorated with complex geometric patterns and representational designs that required exceptional skill and artistic vision. The integration of these techniques with traditional Inca wool production created new categories of luxury textiles that became symbols of imperial authority and markers of social status within the expanding administrative hierarchy. Following the successful integration of Chimu territories, Tupac Inca launched ambitious expansion campaigns toward the south that would extend Inca control across the entire length of the Andes mountain chain. These southern campaigns required crossing some of the world's most challenging terrain, including the Atacama Desert, where water sources were separated by hundreds of miles of waterless wasteland and high-altitude passes that remained snow-covered throughout much of the year. The logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines across such distances necessitated innovations in military organization and resource management that pushed Inca administrative capabilities to their limits. The conquest of the Diaguita peoples in present-day northern Chile demonstrated Tupac Inca's ability to adapt imperial strategies to entirely different environmental and cultural conditions. The Diaguita had developed sophisticated agricultural techniques suited to arid mountain valleys, constructing elaborate terrace systems that maximized water retention while preventing soil erosion. Their settlements featured defensive positions built into cliff faces and mountain slopes, taking advantage of natural terrain features that made direct assault extremely difficult. Inca forces approaching Diaguita territory faced the additional challenge of operating at extreme distances from their logistical base in Cusco. The march from the imperial capital to northern Chilean territories required crossing multiple ecological zones and traversing hundreds of miles of difficult terrain where traditional supply methods proved inadequate. Tupac Inca addressed these challenges by establishing a network of permanent supply bases along the route, each staffed with administrators, craftsmen, and agricultural specialists responsible for supporting military operations, while laying the groundwork for permanent imperial administration. The establishment of administrative centres throughout the newly conquered southern territories reflected Tupac Inca's systematic approach to imperial consolidation. Unlike earlier Inca expansion, which often relied on indirect rule through local leaders, the southern campaigns established direct imperial control through purpose-built administrative complexes that replicated Cusco's organizational structure on a regional scale. These centers, known as provincial capitals, featured standardized architectural elements including ceremonial plazas, storage facilities, residential areas for imperial officials, and workshops for producing goods required by the imperial economy. The construction of Inca Empire in present-day Ecuador exemplified this systematic approach to provincial administration. This massive complex, built entirely from precisely fitted stone blocks transported from distant quarries, served as both military garrison and administrative centre for the northern frontier. The site's layout incorporated traditional Inca architectural principles, while adapting to local topographical conditions, demonstrating the empire's ability to maintain cultural consistency across diverse environments. Archaeological investigations have revealed sophisticated water management systems, extensive storage facilities, and residential areas capable of housing several thousand administrators, craftsmen, and military personnel. The expansion of the Capac or Royal Road System, under Tupac Inca's direction, created the infrastructure necessary for maintaining effective control over territories spanning nearly 4,000 miles from north to south. This engineering achievement required coordinating the labour of hundreds of thousands of workers across multiple ecological zones, each presenting unique construction challenges that demanded innovative solutions. The Highland route alone required building over 200 suspension bridges, cutting roadways through solid rock faces, and constructing retaining walls capable of withstanding seasonal flooding and seismic activity common throughout the Andes. The coastal route presented different but equally demanding construction challenges, requiring the creation of roads across desert regions where shifting sand dunes constantly threatened to obscure carefully engineered pathways. Inca engineers developed techniques for stabilizing road surfaces using stone markers and retaining walls that channeled wind patterns to prevent sand accumulation. Supply stations positioned at regular intervals provided travelers with water, food, and shelter while maintaining the road system through constant repair and maintenance activities conducted by local communities as part of their mita obligations. The development of the Quipu recording system reached unprecedented sophistication during Tupac Inca's reign, evolving from simple counting devices into complex information storage systems capable of recording detailed administrative data, historical narratives, and ceremonial instructions. These knotted cord devices, constructed from cotton or wool fibers dyed in specific colours and arranged according to standardized conventions, enabled imperial administrators to maintain accurate records of population statistics, tribute obligations, military resources, and agricultural production across the empire's vast territories. Master Quipu keepers, known as Quipu Kamayok, underwent extensive training that required memorizing complex coding systems and developing the manual dexterity necessary for creating and interpreting intricate knot patterns. These specialists maintained regional archives containing hundreds of individual Quipu records, each documenting specific aspects of imperial administration within their jurisdictions. The most skilled Quipuca Mayok served in Cusco's central archives, where they compiled summary reports from throughout the empire and maintained master records used by the Sapa Inca and his advisors for policy decisions. The sophistication of Quipu record-keeping enabled imperial administrators to track demographic changes, monitor agricultural production, and coordinate military operations with unprecedented precision. Population censuses conducted using Quipu records provided detailed information about household composition, age distributions, and occupational specializations that allowed for efficient allocation of labor resources and tribute obligations. Agricultural records tracked seasonal production cycles, storage facility inventories, and distribution patterns that ensured food security throughout the empire, while maintaining reserves for emergency situations. The expansion of the Ceque messenger network under Tupac Inca transformed imperial communication capabilities, creating a system that could transmit information across the empire's entire length in approximately 10 days under optimal conditions. This achievement required establishing over 2,000 relay stations, positioned at intervals that allowed trained runners to maintain constant movement without exhaustion. Each station housed multiple messengers, food supplies, and equipment necessary for maintaining continuous operations, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal variations. Ceque training programs developed during this period emphasized not only physical conditioning, but also memorization techniques that enabled messengers to carry complex verbal messages without written records. These specialists learned standardized phrases and numerical codes that allowed them to transmit detailed administrative information while minimizing the risk of communication errors. The most skilled Ceque could carry multiple simultaneous messages, distinguishing between routine administrative communications and urgent military or diplomatic information that required immediate attention. The integration of conquered populations through the Mitima resettlement system reached unprecedented scale during Tupac Inca's reign, involving the relocation of entire ethnic groups across thousands of miles to regions where their particular skills were needed or where their presence would strengthen imperial control. These population movements were planned with careful attention to ecological adaptation, ensuring that relocated communities could effectively contribute to imperial production while maintaining their cultural identities within the broader imperial framework. Highland populations skilled in terraced agriculture were relocated to newly conquered valley regions where they established agricultural systems that increased food production while demonstrating imperial techniques to local populations. Coastal peoples with expertise in fishing and maritime activities were settled along previously unexploited shoreline areas where they developed new resource extraction operations that contributed exotic products to the imperial economy. Craftsmen from various regions were concentrated in specialized production centers where they could share techniques while producing standardized goods for imperial distribution. The religious integration policies implemented throughout Tupac Inca's expanded territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between spiritual beliefs and political loyalty. Rather than suppressing local religious traditions, imperial administrators incorporated regional deities into an expanded pantheon that acknowledged their power while establishing clear hierarchical relationships with Inca gods. Local huacas, or sacred sites, received imperial recognition and support, with Inca priests conducting ceremonies that honoured both traditional spirits and imperial deities. The worship of Inti, the sun god, was promoted throughout conquered territories through the construction of sun temples that replicated architectural and ceremonial elements found in Cusco's Coricancha. These regional temples served as centres for imperial religious instruction, while providing venues for local ceremonies that maintained community traditions within the imperial religious framework. Priests trained in Cusco established permanent positions at these temples, conducting daily rituals that reinforced imperial ideology while participating in local ceremonial cycles that preserved regional spiritual practices. The cultural synthesis achieved during Tupac Inca's reign created a distinctive imperial identity that transcended ethnic boundaries while preserving regional diversity within a unified administrative framework. This achievement required developing standardized practices for education, craft production, and ceremonial activities that could be implemented across diverse populations without completely eliminating local traditions. The result was an imperial culture that combined Inca organizational principles with the best technical and artistic achievements of conquered civilizations, creating a synthesis that exceeded the capabilities of any individual constituent group. The accession of Huayna Capac to the Inca throne in 1493 AD marked the beginning of the empire's most ambitious territorial expansion phase, pushing the boundaries of Tawantinsuyu far beyond the limits established by his predecessors. Unlike Tupac Inca Yupanqui's methodical southern campaigns, Huayna Capac's military operations focused primarily on the northern frontiers, where complex political confederations and challenging tropical environments demanded entirely new approaches to conquest and administration. The new Sapa Inca inherited an empire already spanning approximately 1.8 million square kilometres, yet his reign would witness expansion into territories that would ultimately encompass over 2 million square kilometres, stretching from the Ancas-Mayo River in present-day Colombia to the Mul River in central Chile. Huayna Capac's northern campaigns began with systematic operations against the Chachapoya Confederation, whose cloud forest territories in the eastern slopes of the Andes had long resisted Inca penetration. The Chachapoya, known to the Inca as the Cloud People, had developed sophisticated defensive strategies that took advantage of their region's dense vegetation, unpredictable weather patterns, and mountainous terrain riddled with natural fortifications. Their settlements, built on isolated mountain peaks and connected by narrow pathways carved into cliff faces, presented unique military challenges that required innovative siege techniques and specialized equipment adapted to humid high-altitude conditions. The conquest of Chachapoya territory required Inca forces to operate in environments fundamentally different from the arid highlands where their military organization had evolved. The constant moisture of cloud forests rendered traditional bronze weapons susceptible to rapid corrosion, while dense vegetation limited the effectiveness of projectile weapons and coordinated troop movements that had proven successful in open highland warfare. Inca engineers developed specialized equipment, including hardwood shields treated with tree resins to resist moisture, bronze tools with protective coatings that prevented oxidation, and portable bridges constructed from local materials that could span the deep ravines characteristic of cloud forest topography. The integration of Chachapoya populations into the imperial system revealed Huayna Capac's sophisticated understanding of ethnic diversity management within the expanding empire. The Chachapoya possessed exceptional skills in textile production, particularly the creation of intricate featherwork garments that required detailed knowledge of tropical bird species and sophisticated techniques for preserving and arranging delicate materials. Rather than disrupting these production systems, imperial administrators established workshops that combined traditional Chachapoya techniques with imperial design requirements, creating new categories of ceremonial clothing that became symbols of high status within the imperial hierarchy. The establishment of Cochabamba as a major administrative centre during the Chachapoya campaigns demonstrated Huayna Capac's commitment to permanent imperial presence in newly conquered territories. This complex, constructed in a strategic valley that controlled access routes between highland and lowland regions, featured massive storage facilities capable of housing agricultural surpluses from multiple ecological zones, residential areas for imperial administrators and their families, and workshops where local craftsmen produced goods required by the imperial economy. Archaeological investigations have revealed sophisticated water management systems that channeled mountain streams through carefully engineered canals, providing reliable water supplies for both urban populations and surrounding agricultural areas. Following successful consolidation of Chachapoya territories, Huayna Capac launched his most ambitious campaign targeting the powerful Quito Confederation in present-day Ecuador. The Quito had developed sophisticated political and military organizations that controlled extensive territories in the northern Andes, maintaining trade networks that connected highland populations with coastal societies and Amazonian groups. Their capital city, situated in a fertile valley at nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, housed an estimated 50,000 inhabitants and served as the center of a complex political system that balanced the interests of multiple ethnic groups through carefully negotiated alliances and tribute relationships. The Quito military organization emphasized mobility and rapid deployment across diverse terrain, utilizing specialized units trained for combat in specific ecological zones ranging from high-altitude Paramo grasslands to temperate valley floors. Their weapons included sophisticated composite bows constructed from multiple wood types and reinforced with sinew, bronze-tipped spears designed for both thrusting and throwing, and wooden shields decorated with geometric patterns that identified specific military units and their regional affiliations. Quito warriors wore quilted cotton armour that provided protection against projectile weapons, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid movement across mountainous terrain. The siege of Quito required Huayna Capac to coordinate military operations across multiple fronts while maintaining supply lines that stretched over 1,500 miles from Cusco to the northern frontier. The campaign lasted nearly 3 years, with Inca forces systematically reducing Quito defensive positions while negotiating with local leaders willing to abandon their allegiance to the Confederation's ruling dynasty. The final assault on the capital involved coordinated attacks from 4 directions, with specialized engineering units constructing siege works that gradually tightened around the city's defensive perimeter, while preventing the escape of Quito leadership. The capture of Quito's ruler, Cacha Duchicela, marked a turning point in the northern campaigns, as his submission encouraged voluntary surrender from numerous smaller confederations throughout the region. Huayna Capac demonstrated characteristic pragmatism in his treatment of defeated Quito nobility, incorporating capable leaders into the imperial administrative hierarchy, while relocating potential troublemakers to distant regions where they could contribute their skills without threatening imperial security. The most skilled Quito administrators were brought to Cusco for advanced training in imperial procedures, creating a cadre of bicultural officials capable of bridging differences between traditional Quito practices and Inca administrative requirements. The establishment of Tumapampa as the northern capital represented Huayna Capac's most significant architectural achievement and demonstrated his commitment to creating a permanent imperial presence in recently conquered territories. This massive complex, constructed in the fertile Tomabamba Valley, replicated Cusco's organizational structure, while adapting to local environmental conditions and incorporating architectural elements that acknowledged regional traditions. The site's layout featured a central ceremonial plaza surrounded by precisely fitted stone buildings that housed imperial administrators, religious personnel, and specialized craftsmen responsible for producing goods required by the northern provinces. The construction of Tumapampa required mobilizing thousands of workers from throughout the empire, including skilled stonemasons brought from Cusco, to ensure consistency with imperial architectural standards, local laborers familiar with regional building materials and techniques, and specialists in water management who designed sophisticated canal systems that supplied the complex with reliable fresh water. The precision of stonework at Tumapampa equaled that found in Cusco's most important buildings, with massive granite blocks fitted so perfectly that modern observers struggle to detect joints between individual stones. The complex included extensive storage facilities capable of housing agricultural surpluses from multiple ecological zones, workshops for producing textiles and metalwork, and residential areas designed to accommodate several thousand permanent inhabitants. The religious significance of Tumapampa extended beyond its administrative functions, as Huayna Capac ordered the construction of a sun temple that rivaled Cusco's Coricancha in both architectural sophistication and ceremonial importance. This temple complex featured walls lined with sheets of beaten gold, interior chambers decorated with precious stones and exotic feathers from Amazonian regions, and carefully oriented windows that tracked seasonal solar movements throughout the year. The temple housed sacred objects brought from throughout the empire, including mummified remains of important regional leaders, ceremonial vessels crafted from gold and silver, and textile masterpieces that demonstrated the artistic achievements of various conquered civilizations. The development of agricultural systems throughout Huayna Capac's expanded territories reached unprecedented levels of sophistication, incorporating techniques adapted from multiple ecological zones to maximize food production while maintaining soil fertility across diverse environmental conditions. The empire at its territorial peak encompassed virtually every ecological zone found in South America, from coastal deserts receiving less than 1 inch of annual rainfall to cloud forests where precipitation exceeded 200 inches per year. This environmental diversity required developing specialized agricultural techniques suited to each region's particular conditions, while maintaining the surplus production necessary to support non-agricultural populations, including administrators, craftsmen, military personnel, and religious specialists. The expansion of terraced agriculture, known as andenes, represented one of Huayna Capac's most significant contributions to imperial food security and environmental management. These elaborate stone-faced terraces, constructed on mountain slopes throughout the empire, prevented soil erosion while creating microclimates that extended the altitudinal range of various crop species. The construction of major terrace systems required coordinating the labour of thousands of workers over multiple growing seasons, with specialised teams responsible for quarrying and transporting stone, constructing retaining walls, preparing soil mixtures, and installing drainage systems that prevented waterlogging during rainy seasons. Archaeological investigations of terrace systems constructed during Huayna Capac's reign reveal sophisticated understanding of soil science and hydrology that enabled Inca engineers to create agricultural environments more productive than the natural landscapes they replaced. Terraceville consisted of carefully layered materials, including large stones for drainage, smaller rocks and gravel for water retention, and specially prepared soil mixtures that incorporated organic matter from multiple sources. The resulting agricultural surfaces could support intensive cultivation while maintaining fertility over extended periods through crop rotation systems that alternated nitrogen-fixing legumes with grain and root crops. The management of potato cultivation reached extraordinary levels of sophistication during this period, with imperial agricultural specialists maintaining over 3,000 distinct varieties adapted to specific environmental conditions and culinary requirements. These varieties range from small, intensely flavoured tubers grown at extreme altitudes above 14,000 feet to large starchy potatoes cultivated in temperate valley floors that provided carbohydrate staples for urban populations. The preservation of this genetic diversity required maintaining seed stocks in multiple locations throughout the empire, while coordinating distribution networks that ensured appropriate varieties reached regions where they could thrive. The development of freeze-drying techniques for potato preservation enabled imperial administrators to maintain food security across regions subject to seasonal production variations and periodic crop failures caused by climatic fluctuations. High-altitude processing centres utilise natural freeze-thaw cycles to remove moisture from potatoes, creating chuno, a lightweight, imperishable food product that could be stored for years without deterioration. The production of chuno required precise timing and specialised knowledge of weather patterns, with experienced processors monitoring temperature and humidity conditions to determine optimal processing periods. The expansion of raised field agriculture, known as waru-waru in the Titicaca Basin and other highland regions, demonstrated Huayna Capac's commitment to maximising agricultural productivity in challenging environmental conditions. These elaborate earthwork systems, consisting of raised planting surfaces separated by water-filled canals, created favourable microclimates that protected crops from frost damage while improving soil drainage and fertility. The construction of waru-waru systems required extensive coordination of community labour, with specialised teams responsible for excavating canals, constructing raised beds, and maintaining water control structures that regulated flooding and drainage, according to seasonal requirements. The sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships demonstrated by waru-waru construction enabled Inca agricultural specialists to achieve remarkable productivity in regions previously considered marginal for intensive agriculture. The water-filled canals surrounding raised beds absorbed solar radiation during daylight hours, releasing heat during nighttime periods when frost damage threatened growing crops. This thermal regulation system extended growing seasons while reducing the risk of crop losses due to unpredictable weather patterns common in high-altitude environments. The tribute system administered throughout Huayna Capac's expanded empire represented a masterpiece of economic organisation that balanced the extraction of surplus resources with the maintenance of local production systems necessary for regional food security and social stability. Unlike European feudal systems that emphasised monetary payments, Inca tribute obligations focused primarily on labour contributions and in-kind payments of agricultural products, textiles, and specialised craft goods. This system, known as mita, required each household to contribute specific amounts of labour annually to imperial projects while maintaining sufficient resources for family subsistence and local community obligations. The calculation of tribute obligations required detailed knowledge of regional production capabilities, demographic patterns, and ecological constraints that affected agricultural and craft production in different areas of the empire. Imperial administrators conducted regular censuses using quipu recording systems that documented household composition, age distributions, occupational specializations, and resource availability within each administrative district. This information enabled precise allocation of tribute obligations that maximized imperial revenues while avoiding demands that would undermine local production systems or create social instability. The redistribution networks that balanced tribute extraction with imperial support for local populations during periods of scarcity represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of Inca economic organization. The empire maintained extensive storage systems known as colcas, positioned at strategic locations throughout imperial territory where agricultural surpluses, textiles, and craft goods could be preserved for redistribution during emergencies or seasonal shortages. These storage facilities, constructed with sophisticated ventilation systems and pest control measures, could preserve perishable goods for extended periods while maintaining qualities suitable for human consumption. The management of colca storage systems required specialized administrators trained in inventory control, preservation techniques, and distribution logistics that ensured resources reached populations in need, while maintaining strategic reserves for military operations and major construction projects. Archaeological investigations of storage complexes have revealed sophisticated organizational systems that segregated different types of goods according to their preservation requirements and intended uses. Grain storage areas featured raised floors and ventilation systems that prevented moisture accumulation, while textile storage chambers maintained consistent temperature and humidity levels that preserved delicate fibers and dyes. The development of craft specialization throughout the empire reached unprecedented levels during Huayna Capac's reign, with imperial workshops producing standardized goods that combine the finest techniques from various conquered civilizations while maintaining consistent quality standards across diverse production centers. Metalworking specialists concentrated in regional centers produced bronze tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects using techniques that incorporated innovations from Chimu coastal traditions, highland Inca methods, and specialized knowledge acquired from various conquered groups. The resulting products exceeded the technical capabilities of any individual constituent tradition, while maintaining the distinctive aesthetic qualities that identified them as imperial productions. Textile production achieved extraordinary sophistication through the integration of techniques from multiple regional traditions, creating new categories of luxury fabrics that became symbols of imperial authority and markers of social status within the administrative hierarchy. The finest textiles, known as kumbi cloth, required exceptional skill and artistic vision to produce, with individual garments taking months or years to complete, using threads so fine that modern observers require magnification to appreciate their intricate details. These masterpieces incorporated precious materials, including vicuna wool, silk-like fibers from wild plants, and exotic feathers from tropical regions, creating garments that demonstrated both technical mastery and access to resources from throughout the imperial territory. The sophisticated imperial administration that Huayna Capac had perfected operated through a complex social hierarchy that permeated every aspect of daily life throughout Tawantinsuyu. At the apex of this carefully structured society stood the Sapa Inca himself, whose divine status as the son of Inti elevated him far above ordinary mortals and required elaborate protocols that emphasized his supernatural nature. The emperor's physical person was considered so sacred that commoners could not look directly upon him, and those granted audience approached barefoot, carrying symbolic burdens on their backs while maintaining downcast eyes throughout the encounter. His clothing, woven from the finest vicuna wool and decorated with gold thread and exotic feathers, was worn only once before being ceremonially burned, as garments that had touched the divine ruler's body became too sacred for further use. The royal Panaca lineages, descended from previous Sapa Incas, formed the highest stratum of Inca nobility and maintained responsibility for preserving the mummified remains and property of their deceased ancestors. Each Panica controlled extensive agricultural lands, herds of llamas and alpacas, and workshops where skilled artisans produced goods required for maintaining their ancestors' cult while supporting living descendants. The Panica of Pachakuti, known as Hatun Ailu, possessed particularly extensive holdings, including prime agricultural terraces in the Sacred Valley and workshops in Cusco, where master craftsmen produced ceremonial objects from gold and precious stones. These royal lineages competed intensely for influence and resources, creating political dynamics that could threaten imperial stability if not carefully managed by the reigning Sapa Inca. Below the royal Panicas ranked the Orojones, or Big Ears, so named by Spanish chroniclers for the large gold ear ornaments that marked their noble status. These individuals, drawn from both Inca ethnic groups and thoroughly acculturated members of conquered populations, served as provincial governors, military commanders, and high-ranking administrators throughout the empire. The Orojones underwent rigorous education in Cusco's Yachahuasi schools, where they mastered Quechua language, imperial history, administrative procedures, and religious protocols necessary for effective governance. Their distinctive dress included fine Kumbi cloth garments, elaborate headdresses indicating their specific offices, and jewellery crafted from precious metals that demonstrated their elevated position within the imperial hierarchy. The Curacas, or ethnic lords, represented the crucial intermediary level between imperial administration and local populations throughout the conquered territories. These leaders, who retained authority over their traditional communities while accepting Inca oversight, collected tribute, organised labour gangs for imperial projects, and maintained order within their jurisdictions. The most capable cuarassas received additional territories and responsibilities, creating a meritocratic element within the hereditary noble class that encouraged competent administration, while providing advancement opportunities for exceptional individuals. Their residences in provincial centres featured stone architecture that mimicked imperial styles, while incorporating regional decorative elements, visually representing their dual loyalties to local traditions and imperial authority. The organisation of provincial administration reflected sophisticated understanding of ethnic diversity and regional variations throughout the empire. Each province, known as a Huamani, contained approximately 40,000 households, organised into smaller administrative units that preserved traditional kinship relationships while facilitating imperial control. The decimal system divided these populations into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 households, each supervised by appointed officials responsible for specific administrative functions, including census taking, tribute collection, and labour mobilisation. This hierarchical structure enabled efficient communication between the imperial centre and distant territories while maintaining flexibility necessary for managing diverse populations with different languages, customs, and economic systems. The role of women within Inca society operated through parallel kinship systems that provided females with distinct spheres of authority and responsibility, separate from but complementary to male political structures. The Koya, or queen, held supreme authority over all women throughout the empire and controlled extensive resources including agricultural lands, textile workshops, and religious institutions dedicated to female deities. Her position was not merely ceremonial, as she participated in major policy decisions, conducted diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, and supervised the complex marriage alliances that bound noble families throughout the imperial territory. The Koya's residence in Cusco featured elaborate gardens, workshops where master weavers produced the finest textiles, and ceremonial chambers where she conducted rituals essential for maintaining cosmic balance. The institution of the Aklakuna, or chosen women, represented one of the most distinctive aspects of Inca social organisation and religious practice. These women, selected during childhood for exceptional beauty, intelligence, or noble birth, received specialized education in religious ceremonies, textile production, and food preparation at facilities known as Akalawasi throughout the empire. The most accomplished Akalakuna served as priestesses in major temples, where they maintained sacred fires, prepared ritual foods, and conducted ceremonies essential for imperial religious observances. Others became secondary wives of the Sapa Inca, or were granted as wives to nobles as rewards for exceptional service, creating kinship networks that strengthened political alliances throughout the imperial hierarchy. The Akalawasi facilities, found in every major administrative centre, functioned as combination schools, workshops, and religious institutions, where young women mastered skills essential for elite female roles within imperial society. The curriculum included advanced weaving techniques that produced kumbi cloth of extraordinary quality, food preparation methods for ceremonial feasts, religious protocols for major festivals, and administrative procedures for managing household resources. Archaeological investigations of Akalawasi sites have revealed sophisticated workshops equipped with specialized looms, storage areas for precious materials, including vicuna wool and exotic feathers, and residential quarters designed to house several hundred women under careful supervision. The daily routines of common citizens throughout the empire revolved around agricultural cycles that determined work patterns, religious observances, and social interactions within local communities. The Inca calendar, based on careful observation of solar and lunar cycles, divided the year into 12 months that corresponded to specific agricultural activities and religious celebrations. Each month brought particular responsibilities including field preparation, planting, cultivation, and harvest activities that required coordinated community effort organised through traditional Ainu kinship groups. The timing of these activities varied according to altitude and local climate conditions, with highland communities planting potatoes during different seasons than valley populations growing maize or coastal peoples cultivating cotton. The integration of work and worship characterized every aspect of agricultural life, with religious ceremonies marking crucial transitions in the farming cycle and ensuring supernatural support for successful harvests. Before beginning field preparation, community members conducted rituals honouring Pachamama, the Earth Mother, offering coca leaves, chicha beer, and specially prepared foods to ensure her cooperation during the growing season. Similar ceremonies accompanied planting, when families buried small offerings in newly prepared fields while requesting protection from frost, hail, and pests that could destroy developing crops. The harvest season brought elaborate Thanksgiving celebrations that acknowledged divine assistance while sharing the fruits of collective labour among all community members. The celebration of Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, represented the most important religious observance throughout the empire and demonstrated the sophisticated coordination of ceremonial activities across vast territories. This winter solstice celebration, held annually in June, brought together representatives from throughout Tawantinsuyu for elaborate ceremonies in Cusco that lasted several days and involved thousands of participants. The festival began with the Sapa Inca and highest nobles gathering at dawn in the main plaza to greet the returning sun with prayers and offerings, followed by processions that carried sacred objects and mummified ancestors through the city streets, while crowds of spectators maintained reverent silence. The preparation for Inti Raymi required months of coordinated effort, involving communities throughout the empire, each contributing specialized products needed for the celebration. Highland regions provided llamas and alpacas for ritual sacrifices, coastal areas contributed shells and exotic foods, while tropical regions supplied colourful feathers and aromatic plants used in ceremonial preparations. The transportation of these materials to Cusco demonstrated the efficiency of imperial road systems and the loyalty of provincial populations who considered participation in major festivals both a religious obligation and an expression of imperial citizenship. The educational systems that prepared noble youth for administrative responsibilities reflected sophisticated understanding of the knowledge and skills required for effective imperial governance. The Yachahuasi schools in Cusco provided 4-year programs that combined practical training with theoretical instruction in subjects essential for imperial administration. Students learned to create and interpret quipu records, mastered the complex protocols governing interactions between different social classes, studied the astronomical knowledge necessary for maintaining accurate calendars, and memorized the historical narratives that legitimized Inca rule over diverse populations. The curriculum emphasized oral tradition and memorization techniques that enabled students to preserve and transmit vast amounts of information without written records. Master teachers, known as amautas, guided students through systematic study of imperial history, beginning with Cretan myths that established the divine origins of Inca authority and proceeding through detailed accounts of each Sapa Inca's achievements and the expansion of imperial territory. Students learned to recite genealogies of noble families, memorize the locations and characteristics of important huacas throughout the empire, and mastered the complex ceremonial procedures required for major religious festivals. The instruction in practical skills included training in military tactics, engineering principles, and agricultural techniques that prepared future administrators for the diverse challenges they would encounter in provincial assignments. Students learned to calculate tribute obligations based on demographic and production data, practiced organizing labor gangs for construction projects, and studied the diplomatic protocols necessary for negotiating with local leaders in newly conquered territories. The most promising students received advanced training in specialized subjects including astronomy, medicine, and craft production that prepared them for technical positions within the imperial bureaucracy. The transmission of technical knowledge throughout the empire operated through apprenticeship systems that preserved specialized skills while adapting them to imperial requirements and local conditions. Master craftsmen in imperial workshops trained selected students in techniques for working precious metals, creating fine textiles, and producing ceremonial objects that met the quality standards required for imperial use. These workshops, located in major administrative centres throughout the empire, served as centres for technical innovation, where traditional methods combined with new techniques learned from conquered populations to create improved products and more efficient production processes. The preservation of historical knowledge relied on trained specialists known as quipu kamayok, who maintained detailed records of imperial achievements, genealogies, and significant events using complex quipu systems. These individuals underwent extensive training that required mastering the intricate coding methods used to record different types of information, developing the manual skills necessary for creating precisely knotted recording devices, and memorizing the contextual information that gave meaning to abstract knot patterns. The most skilled Kipuka Mayok served in Cusco's central archives, where they compiled summary reports from throughout the empire and maintained master records used by imperial administrators for policy decisions. The daily life of common citizens reflected the careful balance between imperial obligations and traditional community practices that characterized Inca social organization. Each household owed specific amounts of labor annually to imperial projects, calculated according to the number of adult males available for work and the particular skills they possessed. Agricultural communities typically fulfilled these obligations during seasons when farming activities required less intensive labor, with men participating in construction projects, military service, or transportation duties, while women contributed through textile production, food preparation, or craft manufacturing. The Mita labour system operated according to principles of reciprocity that obligated imperial administrators to provide workers with food, tools, and other necessities during their service periods. Communities that contributed labour for major construction projects received access to imperial storage facilities during times of scarcity, while individuals who demonstrated exceptional skills might be selected for permanent positions within the imperial bureaucracy. This system created bonds of mutual obligation that extended beyond simple tribute extraction to encompass genuine reciprocal relationships between rulers and subjects. The organization of local markets throughout the empire facilitated exchange of goods between different ecological zones, while maintaining imperial control over the distribution of valuable resources. These markets, held at regular intervals in administrative centers, brought together producers from highland, valley and coastal regions who exchanged agricultural products, craft goods and raw materials according to traditional barter systems. Imperial officials supervised these exchanges, ensuring fair trading practices while collecting information about production levels and resource availability that informed administrative decisions about tribute obligations and surplus distribution. The integration of religious observances into market activities reflected the sacred nature of exchange relationships and the importance of maintaining cosmic balance through proper ceremonial procedures. Before beginning trading activities, participants conducted rituals acknowledging the spiritual forces that governed abundance and scarcity, offering prayers and small gifts to ensure successful exchanges. These ceremonies also reinforce social relationships between trading partners from different regions, creating networks of mutual obligation that strengthened imperial unity while preserving local cultural traditions. The spiritual universe of the Inca Empire encompassed a complex theological system that integrated multiple layers of divine authority, cosmic forces, and sacred geography into a unified framework governing every aspect of imperial life. At the pinnacle of this celestial hierarchy stood Inti, the sun god, whose golden disk provided the physical manifestation of divine power that sustained all life throughout Tawantinsuyu. Inti's worship centered on the recognition that his daily journey across the sky determined agricultural cycles, seasonal changes, and the cosmic order that maintained harmony between the natural and supernatural worlds. The Sapa Inca's divine status derived directly from his position as Inti's earthly representative, making the emperor's authority both political and sacred, requiring absolute obedience from subjects who understood that resistance to imperial rule constituted rebellion against the fundamental forces governing the universe. The crater deity Viracocha occupied a position of supreme cosmic authority that transcended even Inti's solar dominance, representing the primordial force that had shaped the world from primeval chaos and established the fundamental principles governing existence. Viracocha's role in Inca cosmology encompassed both creation and destruction, as this deity possessed the power to reshape reality according to divine will while maintaining the delicate balance between opposing forces that sustained the ordered universe. The most sacred myths described Viracocha emerging from the waters of Lake Titicaca to create the sun, moon and stars before fashioning human beings from stone and breathing life into their forms. Archaeological evidence from Tiwanaku and other pre-Inca sites suggests that Viracocha worship predated Inca political dominance, indicating the empire's sophisticated approach to religious integration that absorbed powerful local deities rather than replacing them entirely. Pachamama, the Earth Mother, provided the feminine counterpart to masculine solar and crater deities, embodying the fertile forces that produced agricultural abundance while nurturing all living beings within her protective embrace. Her worship permeated every aspect of agricultural life throughout the empire, from the ritual offerings buried in newly planted fields to the Thanksgiving ceremonies that acknowledged her generosity during harvest seasons. Pachamama's sacred geography encompassed the entire Andean landscape, with specific mountains, valleys, springs and caves serving as manifestations of her divine presence that required regular ceremonial attention from local communities. The integration of Pachamama worship with imperial religious practices demonstrated the Inca understanding that political authority required supernatural legitimacy rooted in the fundamental forces governing agricultural production and human survival. The concept of huaca represented perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Inca religious practice, encompassing any natural or artificial object, location, or phenomenon that possessed supernatural power or significance within the cosmic order. Huacas ranged from massive mountain peaks that dominated regional landscapes to small stones with unusual shapes, from ancient burial sites containing ancestral remains to springs that provided water during dry seasons. Each huaca required specific ceremonial protocols that acknowledged its particular spiritual attributes while maintaining the reciprocal relationships between human communities and the supernatural forces governing their environment. The imperial administration systematically catalogued huacas throughout conquered territories, integrating local sacred sites into the broader religious framework while preserving the specific ritual practices that maintained their spiritual efficacy. The Ceque system represented the most sophisticated expression of Inca sacred geography, organizing the landscape around Cusco into a complex network of imaginary lines that connected the Coricancha temple with over 300 huacas distributed throughout the imperial capital and surrounding valleys. These seques radiated outward from the central temple like spokes of a massive wheel, creating a sacred map that integrated astronomical observations, agricultural cycles, ritual obligations, and social organization into a unified system governing religious and administrative activities. Each Ceque was maintained by specific Ayllu kinship groups, who bore responsibility for conducting ceremonies at designated huacas, preserving oral traditions associated with particular sites, and maintaining the physical structures that marked sacred locations throughout the imperial territory. Archaeological investigations have revealed that the Ceque system incorporated sophisticated astronomical alignments that track the movements of celestial bodies throughout the year, enabling Inca priests to maintain accurate calendars essential for coordinating agricultural activities and religious ceremonies across the empire's diverse ecological zones. Specific huacas mark the positions where the sun rose and set during solstices and equinoxes, while other sites aligned with the appearances of prominent constellations that governed planting and harvest seasons. The integration of astronomical knowledge with sacred geography created a comprehensive system for understanding cosmic relationships that influenced every aspect of imperial administration, from tribute collection schedules to the timing of major military campaigns. The complexity of Ceque organization extended beyond simple radial patterns to encompass hierarchical relationships between different categories of huacas and the social groups responsible for their maintenance. The most important seques, associated with the royal panicus and highest-ranking noble families, connected the Coricancha with major temples and ceremonial centres that played crucial roles in imperial religious observances. Secondary seques linked the central temple with huacas maintained by lesser noble families and specialised craft groups, while the remaining lines connected with sacred sites associated with common Ayllu groups, who provided agricultural labour and military service to the imperial state. The ritual practices surrounding huaca worship required extensive knowledge of ceremonial protocols that varied according to the specific spiritual attributes of individual sacred sites and the seasonal cycles governing their supernatural efficacy. Mountain huacas typically received offerings of coca leaves, chicha beer, and llama fat during ceremonies that acknowledged their role as sources of water and protectors of agricultural terraces constructed on their slopes. Spring huacas required different offerings, including shells brought from distant coastal regions, exotic feathers from tropical birds, and specially prepared foods that honoured the life-giving properties of fresh water. The timing of these ceremonies followed complex calendrical calculations that ensured offerings were made when supernatural forces were most receptive to human requests for assistance and protection. The practice of capacocha, or human sacrifice, represented the most solemn and significant expression of Inca religious devotion, reserved for extraordinary circumstances that threatened the stability of the empire or required divine intervention to ensure cosmic harmony. These ceremonies typically involved the sacrifice of children selected for their physical perfection and noble birth, who underwent elaborate purification rituals before being transported to sacred sites where their deaths would provide the most powerful possible offerings to supernatural forces. Archaeological evidence from high-altitude ceremonial sites throughout the Andes has revealed remarkably preserved remains of Capac victims, whose bodies were naturally mummified by extreme cold and dry conditions that prevented decomposition for centuries. The selection process for Capac victims followed strict criteria that emphasized spiritual purity and social significance, with candidates chosen from among the children of provincial nobles or Akela women whose elevated status within imperial society made their sacrifice particularly meaningful to supernatural forces. These children received special treatment during the months preceding their sacrifice, including fine clothing, abundant food, and instruction in the religious significance of their impending deaths. The ceremonies themselves involved elaborate processions that transported victims to sacred sites, often located on mountain peaks above 20,000 feet in altitude, where the proximity to celestial forces enhanced the spiritual efficacy of their sacrifice. The worship of Malkirs, or mummified ancestors, formed a central component of Inca religious practice that maintained direct connections between living communities and deceased family members who continued to influence worldly affairs from their supernatural realm. The preservation techniques developed by Inca specialists enabled the creation of lifelike mummies that retained recognizable features and could be dressed in fine clothing for ceremonial appearances during major festivals. These preserved ancestors were housed in special chambers within family compounds where they received daily offerings of food and drink while participating in important decisions affecting their descendants' welfare. The most significant Malki were the mummified remains of former Sapa Incas, whose preserved bodies retained their divine status and continued to own property, receive tribute, and influence imperial policy through their living Pachakuti descendants. During major ceremonies, these royal mummies were transported through Cusco streets on elaborate litters while crowds of spectators offered prayers and gifts to acknowledge their continued authority over imperial affairs. The Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon described witnessing these processions, noting the reverent behavior of participants who treated the mummified rulers as living beings, capable of responding to their supplications and concerns. The role of divination in imperial decision-making reflected the Inca understanding that successful governance required supernatural guidance to navigate the complex spiritual forces influencing political and military affairs. Professional diviners, known as Ichuri, employed various techniques including the examination of llama entrails, the interpretation of coca leaf patterns, and the observation of natural phenomena to determine the most auspicious timing for important undertakings. These specialists underwent extensive training that combined technical knowledge of divination methods with deep understanding of imperial history, astronomical cycles, and the spiritual attributes of various huacas that might influence specific situations. The most important divination ceremonies accompanied major policy decisions, including declarations of war, the selection of marriage partners for royal family members, and the timing of construction projects that required massive labour mobilisation. The results of these consultations could significantly influence imperial strategy, with military campaigns delayed or redirected based on supernatural warnings revealed through divination practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that the location and orientation of major construction projects, including administrative centres and ceremonial complexes, were determined through divination procedures that identified sites where spiritual forces would support imperial objectives. The construction of Machu Picchu represented perhaps the most sophisticated integration of astronomical observation, ceremonial function, an architectural achievement in the entire Inca Empire. This remarkable complex, built on a narrow ridge between two mountain peaks at an altitude of nearly 8,000 feet, served multiple functions as a royal estate, astronomical observatory, and ceremonial centre, where the most important religious rituals maintained cosmic harmony essential for imperial prosperity. The site's location provided unobstructed views of celestial phenomena throughout the year, enabling Inca astronomers to track solar and lunar cycles with extraordinary precision while conducting ceremonies that synchronized earthly activities with cosmic rhythms. The architectural layout of Machu Picchu incorporated numerous structures specifically designed for astronomical observations, including the Intihuatana stone, whose carefully carved surfaces track the sun's movement throughout the year while serving as a focal point for solar worship ceremonies. The Temple of the Sun featured precisely oriented windows that framed the sunrise during winter and summer solstices, creating dramatic light effects that demonstrated the intimate relationship between architectural design and celestial phenomena. The complex's water management system channeled mountain springs through carefully engineered canals that supplied fountains and pools used in purification rituals, while creating the sound effects that enhance ceremonial experiences. The residential areas within Machu Picchu reflected the social hierarchy governing access to this sacred site, with the finest stone buildings reserved for royal family members and high-ranking priests, while secondary structures housed the craftsmen, servants, and agricultural workers necessary for maintaining the complex's operations. The agricultural terraces surrounding the ceremonial centre produced exotic crops, including coca leaves and tropical fruits that could not be grown at such high altitudes under normal circumstances, demonstrating the sophisticated environmental manipulation techniques that enabled Inca engineers to create artificial microclimates suited to specific agricultural requirements. Ollantaytambo served as both a military fortress and ceremonial centre that controlled access to the sacred valley, while providing a venue for religious observances that honoured the mountain spirits governing the region's agricultural productivity. The massive stone terraces that characterised this site required transporting granite blocks weighing several tons from quarries located across the Urubamba River, a feat accomplished through coordinated human labour supplemented by sophisticated engineering techniques, including ramps, rollers and lever systems. The precision of stonework at Ollantaytambo equals that found at any Inca site, with individual blocks fitted so perfectly that modern observers struggle to detect joints between adjacent stones. The ceremonial functions of Ollantaytambo centered on its role as a solar temple where priests conducted daily rituals, acknowledging Inti's life-giving power, while requesting continued protection for the agricultural communities scattered throughout the sacred valley. The site's orientation enabled precise tracking of seasonal solar movements, with specific architectural features designed to frame sunrise and sunset positions during solstices and equinoxes. The integration of astronomical observations with agricultural ceremonies created a comprehensive system for coordinating farming activities throughout the region, while maintaining the spiritual relationships that ensured supernatural support for human endeavours. Pisac represented another crucial component in the network of ceremonial centres that dotted the sacred valley, serving as both an agricultural research facility and astronomical observatory, where Inca specialists developed improved cultivation techniques while conducting the celestial observations necessary for maintaining accurate calendars. The extensive terrace systems surrounding Pisac enabled experimentation with different crop varieties and cultivation methods, with results documented through Quipu records that preserve technical knowledge for application throughout the empire. The site's elevated position provided unobstructed views of celestial phenomena while creating microclimates that extended the growing season for temperature-sensitive crops. The religious significance of Pisac extended beyond its practical functions, to encompass its role as a sacred landscape where the spiritual forces governing agricultural abundance could be properly honoured through elaborate ceremonial cycles. The site contained numerous huacas, including natural rock formations, springs, and cave systems that served as focal points for rituals, acknowledging the supernatural powers that determined crop success or failure. The integration of these sacred sites with astronomical observation points created a comprehensive ceremonial complex where earthly and celestial phenomena merged into unified expressions of cosmic harmony essential for imperial prosperity and stability. The architectural mastery that defined Inca civilization reached its zenith through revolutionary construction techniques that transformed massive stone blocks into structures of unprecedented durability and precision. The famous ashlar masonry technique, which joined stones without mortar, required sophisticated understanding of geology, physics, and engineering principles that enabled Inca builders to create walls capable of withstanding the seismic activity common throughout the Andes. Master stonemasons selected granite, andesite, and limestone blocks based on their structural properties and visual characteristics, then shaped each piece using bronze tools, wooden wedges, and abrasive sand to achieve the precise angles necessary for perfect fitting. The process began with rough shaping at quarry sites, where workers used controlled fracturing techniques to split massive boulders along natural grain lines, creating manageable blocks that could be transported to construction sites through coordinated human effort supplemented by wooden rollers, rope systems, and carefully constructed ramps. The transportation of these enormous stones across mountainous terrain represented one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in human history, with individual blocks weighing up to 200 tons moved distances of several miles using only human labour and simple mechanical devices. Archaeological investigations at quarry sites have revealed evidence of sophisticated planning that minimised transportation distances while ensuring access to stone with appropriate structural characteristics for specific construction purposes. Workers carved channels and grooves into rock faces to guide the fracturing process, creating stones with predetermined shapes that reduced the amount of finish work required at construction sites. The coordination of these operations required detailed knowledge of seasonal weather patterns, as transportation activities were typically conducted during dry seasons when roads remained passable and workers could maintain the steady progress necessary for completing massive construction projects within reasonable timeframes. The fitting process for ashlar masonry demanded extraordinary precision and patience, with individual stones shaped to match the irregular contours of adjacent blocks through repeated cycles of measurement, carving, and testing. Master craftsmen used bronze tools including chisels, scrapers, and polishing implements to gradually refine stone surfaces until they achieved the perfect fit that characterized the finest Inca construction. The most skilled workers could create joints so precise that knife blades could not penetrate between adjacent stones, while the overall wall surface remained level and stable despite the irregular shapes of individual components. This technique required understanding the structural properties of different stone types, as softer materials could be shaped more easily but lack the durability necessary for major construction projects, while harder stones provided superior longevity at the cost of increased labour requirements for shaping and finishing. The earthquake-resistant characteristics of Inca construction derived from sophisticated understanding of seismic forces and structural engineering principles that enabled buildings to flex during ground movement without suffering catastrophic damage. The trapezoidal shape characteristic of Inca doorways, windows, and wall profiles distributed stress loads more effectively than rectangular openings, while the slight inward lean of wall surfaces lowered the centre of gravity and improved structural stability. The absence of mortar allowed individual stones to move slightly during seismic events, dissipating energy that might otherwise cause rigid structures to crack or collapse. Archaeological evidence from sites affected by major earthquakes demonstrates the effectiveness of these techniques, with Inca walls remaining intact while later Spanish colonial structures built using European methods, suffered extensive damage from identical seismic forces. The integration of buildings with natural landscapes represented a fundamental principle of Inca architecture that emphasized harmony between human construction and environmental features, rather than the domination of nature characteristic of many other civilizations. Architects carefully studied topographical conditions before beginning construction, designing structures that followed natural contours while taking advantage of existing rock formations, water sources, and defensive positions. The most sophisticated examples of this approach incorporated living rock into building foundations and walls, creating seamless transitions between natural and constructed elements that enhanced both structural stability and aesthetic appeal. The technique required exceptional skill in reading geological formations and understanding how different rock types would respond to construction activities, as improper integration could create weak points that compromise structural integrity. The construction of Sacsayhuaman Fortress demonstrated the ultimate expression of Inca engineering capabilities, combining massive stone blocks with sophisticated defensive design in a structure that served both military and ceremonial functions. The fortress's distinctive zigzag walls incorporated stones weighing up to 200 tons, fitted with such precision that the joints between blocks remain virtually invisible despite centuries of weathering and seismic activity. The construction process required coordinating the labour of thousands of workers over several decades, with specialised teams responsible for quarrying, transportation, shaping, and placement of individual stones, according to detailed plans that ensured structural integrity, while creating the complex geometric patterns that characterized the finished walls. The site's elevated position overlooking Cusco provided commanding views of the surrounding valley, while creating natural defensive advantages that were enhanced through careful architectural planning. The Capac or Royal Road System, represented the most extensive transportation network in the pre-Columbian Americas, spanning over 25,000 kilometers of carefully engineered pathways that connected the empire's 4 regions through some of the world's most challenging terrain. The highland route, known as the Capac proper, traversed the Andes from north to south, requiring construction techniques adapted to extreme altitudes, steep grades, and unpredictable weather conditions that could make travel impossible during certain seasons. Engineers carved roadways into cliff faces, constructed elaborate stone stairways that enabled foot traffic to navigate steep slopes, and built retaining walls that prevented erosion during heavy rains. The coastal route paralleled the Pacific shoreline, crossing desert regions where shifting sand dunes constantly threatened to obscure carefully marked pathways, requiring different construction techniques including stone markers and elevated causeways that remained visible despite environmental challenges. The engineering challenges of road construction in the Andes required innovative solutions for crossing rivers, gorges, and other geographical obstacles that block direct routes between important destinations. Suspension bridges woven from maguey fibre and other plant materials spanned distances of up to 150 feet, supported by massive stone anchors embedded in rock faces on either side of the crossing. These bridges required constant maintenance performed by local communities as part of their mitta obligations, with specialised techniques for weaving replacement cables and adjusting tension to accommodate seasonal changes in temperature and humidity that affected fibre strength. The construction process began with stretching initial guide cables across the span, followed by the installation of load-bearing cables that supported the walking surface and protective side barriers that prevented travellers from falling into the depths below. The maintenance of suspension bridges required detailed knowledge of fibre characteristics and weaving techniques that varied according to local plant materials and environmental conditions. Highland bridges utilised wool from llamas and alpacas combined with plant fibres to create cables capable of supporting heavy loads while resisting the effects of extreme temperature variations common at high altitudes. Coastal bridges relied primarily on cotton and maguey fibres, that better withstood the humidity and salt air characteristic of maritime environments. The replacement schedule for bridge components followed carefully calculated cycles that ensured structural integrity, while minimizing the labor requirements imposed on local communities, with major reconstruction projects typically conducted during dry seasons, when weather conditions facilitated intensive construction activities. The construction of tunnels through solid rock represented another remarkable achievement of Inca engineering, enabling roads to maintain direct routes despite mountainous terrain that would otherwise require lengthy detours around geographical obstacles. These tunnels, carved using bronze tools and controlled fracturing techniques, required sophisticated understanding of geology and structural engineering to ensure stability while minimizing construction time and labor requirements. The process began with careful examination of rock formations to identify the most suitable routes that avoided unstable materials or underground water sources that could compromise structural integrity. Workers used fire-setting techniques to heat rock surfaces, then applied cold water to create thermal shock that fractured stone along predetermined lines, gradually excavating passages wide enough to accommodate foot traffic and pack animals. The way stations, known as tambos, positioned at regular intervals along major routes, provided essential services for travellers while serving as administrative centres where imperial officials monitored traffic and collected information about conditions throughout the empire. These facilities typically included sleeping quarters for messengers and other official travellers, storage areas for food and equipment, workshops for maintaining and repairing travel gear, and corrals for pack animals that required rest and feeding during long journeys. The architectural design of tambos reflected their dual functions as rest stops and administrative centres, with standardised layouts that included ceremonial spaces for conducting official business, residential areas for permanent staff, and defensive features that provided protection against potential attacks from hostile groups operating in remote regions. The agricultural engineering achievements of the Inca Empire encompassed sophisticated irrigation systems that enabled intensive cultivation in environments ranging from coastal deserts to high-altitude mountain slopes where natural rainfall patterns could not support the agricultural production necessary for feeding dense populations. The construction of major irrigation networks required coordinating the labour of entire communities over multiple growing seasons, with specialised teams responsible for surveying water sources, designing canal systems, and constructing the stone-lined channels that carried water across long distances without significant loss to seepage or evaporation. The most ambitious projects diverted entire rivers through carefully engineered channels that followed natural contours while maintaining the gradual slopes necessary for consistent water flow throughout extensive agricultural areas. The terraced farming systems, known as andenes, transformed steep mountain slopes into productive agricultural land through construction techniques that prevented soil erosion while creating microclimates suited to specific crop requirements. The construction process began with careful site selection that identified slopes with appropriate orientation, drainage characteristics, and soil conditions for supporting intensive agriculture. Workers constructed stone retaining walls using fitted blocks that provided structural stability while allowing controlled drainage that prevented waterlogging during rainy seasons. The terrace fill consisted of carefully layered materials, including large stones for drainage, smaller rocks for water retention, and specially prepared soil mixtures that incorporated organic matter from multiple sources to create optimal growing conditions for different crop types. The Experimental Agricultural Centre at Moray represented the pinnacle of Inca agricultural engineering, featuring circular terrace depressions that created distinct microclimates for testing crop varieties and cultivation techniques under controlled conditions. The site's unique design utilised natural topographical features to create temperature variations of up to 15 degrees Celsius between different terrace levels, enabling researchers to simulate growing conditions found at various altitudes throughout the empire. the construction required precise engineering calculations to ensure proper drainage while maintaining the specific environmental conditions necessary for agricultural experimentation. Each circular depression contained multiple terrace levels with different soil compositions, irrigation systems, and sun exposure patterns that enabled systematic comparison of crop performance under varying conditions. The metallurgical achievements of the Inca Empire combined sophisticated smelting techniques with artistic mastery that produced both utilitarian tools and ceremonial objects of extraordinary beauty and technical excellence. Bronze production reached unprecedented scales through the development of specialized workshops where skilled craftsmen maintained furnaces capable of achieving the high temperatures necessary for alloying copper and tin into durable metals suitable for tools, weapons, and architectural elements. The smelting process required detailed knowledge of ore characteristics, fuel requirements, and temperature control techniques that ensured consistent alloy composition while maximizing production efficiency. Archaeological investigations of metallurgical sites have revealed sophisticated furnace designs that utilize natural wind patterns to maintain optimal temperatures while minimizing fuel consumption through careful control of airflow and combustion chamber design. The working of precious metals for religious and ceremonial purposes represented the highest expression of Inca metallurgical artistry, with master craftsmen producing objects that combined technical excellence with symbolic significance essential for imperial religious observances. Gold, considered the sweat of the sun god Inti, was reserved for the most sacred ceremonial objects, including temple decorations, royal regalia, and offerings buried with important deceased individuals. The techniques for working gold included hammering, repousse decoration, and lost wax casting that enabled the creation of complex three-dimensional forms with intricate surface details. Silver, associated with the moon goddess Mamaquilla, was used for ceremonial vessels, jewelry, and architectural elements that reflected lunar symbolism while demonstrating the technical capabilities of imperial craftsmen. The production of kumbi cloth represented the pinnacle of Inca textile achievement, requiring exceptional skill and artistic vision to create garments reserved for the highest levels of imperial society. The finest kumbi utilized vicuna wool, obtained from wild animals that produced fiber of extraordinary softness and strength, available only in limited quantities that made these textiles among the most valuable products in the imperial economy. The preparation of vicuna fiber required specialized techniques for cleaning, sorting, and spinning that preserved the natural characteristics while creating threads fine enough for weaving complex patterns with extraordinary detail. The most skilled weavers could produce fabrics with thread counts exceeding modern industrial standards, creating garments that served as symbols of imperial authority while demonstrating the technical mastery achieved by Inca craftsmen. The ceramic production throughout the empire combined functional requirements with artistic expression that created distinctive regional styles while maintaining overall consistency in quality and decorative themes. The most sophisticated ceramics featured polychrome decoration that required multiple firing stages and precise temperature control to achieve the brilliant colors and durable finishes characteristic of imperial pottery. The production process began with careful selection and preparation of clay that incorporated specific mineral additives to improve workability and firing characteristics. Specialized workshops maintained kilns capable of achieving consistent temperatures while providing controlled atmospheres that determined the final coloration of ceramic surfaces through complex chemical reactions between clay minerals and firing conditions. The ceramic workshops of Cusco continued producing their distinctive polychrome vessels throughout 1525, yet the empire's artisans worked under an ominous shadow that had begun spreading across Tawantinsuyu months before any Spaniard set foot in the imperial heartland. European diseases, particularly smallpox, had preceded direct Spanish contact by several years, travelling along the extensive trade networks that connected the Inca Empire with northern regions where Spanish expeditions had established temporary footholds. The pathogen moved invisibly through indigenous populations who possessed no immunity to Old World diseases, creating a biological catastrophe that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the Andes before military conquest began. Huayna Capac himself fell victim to this epidemic while campaigning in the northern provinces around Quito, where he had established his secondary capital at Tumipampa to better govern the empire's most recently conquered territories. The Sapa Inca's illness began with the characteristic fever and skin eruptions that marked smallpox infection, symptoms that imperial physicians could neither understand nor treat, using traditional Andean medical knowledge. Within days, the divine ruler who had expanded Tawantinsuyu to its greatest territorial extent lay dying in his northern palace, surrounded by nobles and priests who watched helplessly as supernatural forces beyond their comprehension claimed their god-king's life. The death of Huayna Capac in 1525 created an unprecedented succession crisis that exposed fundamental weaknesses in the imperial political system. Traditional Inca succession practices did not follow strict primogeniture, instead allowing the Sapa Inca to select his most capable son from among numerous potential heirs born to different wives and concubines. This system had functioned effectively during earlier reigns when clear military or administrative superiority distinguished particular candidates, but Huayna Capac's death occurred before he could formally designate his successor, leaving multiple princes with legitimate claims to imperial authority. Huascar, whose name meant golden chain in reference to the massive ceremonial chain crafted to commemorate his birth, represented the traditional choice for succession as the son born to Huayna Capac's principal wife, or Coya, in the sacred city of Cusco. His mother's noble lineage traced back to the royal Panakas of previous Sapa Incas, providing him with powerful allies among the established aristocracy who controlled the empire's religious and administrative institutions. Huascar's supporters emphasized his legitimate birth and his residence in the imperial capital, where he had participated in the ceremonial cycles that maintained cosmic harmony while learning the protocols governing imperial administration from experienced court officials. Atahualpa, born to one of Huayna Capac's secondary wives in the Northern Territories, possessed different but equally compelling qualifications for imperial leadership. His mother belonged to the conquered Quito nobility, making his claim representative of the empire's newer territorial acquisitions and the populations who had been integrated into Tawantinsuyu during the most recent expansion campaigns. More significantly, Atahualpa had accompanied his father on military expeditions throughout the northern provinces, gaining practical experience in warfare and provincial administration, while building personal relationships with the army commanders who controlled the empire's most effective military units. The geographical separation between these rival claimants reflected deeper tensions within the imperial structure that had developed during Huayna Capac's reign. The establishment of Tumipampa as a northern administrative centre had created a secondary power base that competed with Cusco for resources and influence, while the integration of Quito and other northern populations had introduced new political dynamics that challenged traditional Inca dominance. The northern armies, composed largely of recently conquered peoples who owed their advancement to imperial service rather than hereditary status, developed loyalties to successful commanders like Atahualpa, rather than to the distant imperial capital where they had never served. The initial phase of the succession dispute involved diplomatic manoeuvring, as both claimants sought to consolidate support among provincial governors, military commanders, and religious authorities throughout the empire. Huascar's position in Cusco provided him with access to the imperial treasury, the support of established noble families, and control over the ceremonial institutions that legitimized Inca rule through religious observances. He immediately began conducting the rituals traditionally associated with imperial succession, including consultations with the mummified remains of previous Sapa Incas, whose supernatural guidance was considered essential for major political decisions. Atahualpa's response demonstrated his superior understanding of practical politics and military realities, as he focused on securing the loyalty of army units stationed throughout the northern provinces rather than engaging in ceremonial competitions he could not win from his distant position. The northern armies had been campaigning continuously for several years, developing cohesion and professional competence that distinguished them from the garrison forces stationed around Cusco. These veteran units possessed superior equipment, extensive combat experience, and loyalty to commanders who had shared the hardships and victories of extended military campaigns in challenging environments. The transformation of diplomatic rivalry into open warfare occurred gradually, as both sides recognized that peaceful resolution was impossible, given the fundamental incompatibility of their claims and the political forces supporting them. Huasca's attempts to assert authority over northern provinces met resistance from local administrators who had developed personal relationships with Atahualpa during his years of service in the region. Similarly, Atahualpa's efforts to gain recognition from Cusco-based nobility encountered opposition from traditional aristocrats, who viewed him as an upstart whose northern connections threatened their established privileges and influence. The military campaigns that followed revealed the profound impact of European diseases on imperial military capabilities and social organization. Smallpox and other epidemics had decimated populations throughout the empire, killing experienced administrators, skilled craftsmen, and military personnel whose knowledge and abilities were essential for maintaining imperial functions. Entire communities had been abandoned as survivors fled infected areas, disrupting agricultural production and tribute collection systems that provided the resources necessary for supporting large armies. The demographic catastrophe had particularly severe effects on military organization, as the disease preferentially killed adults in their prime working years, while sparing children and elderly individuals who could not contribute effectively to military campaigns. Atahualpa's northern armies possessed significant advantages in mobility, equipment, and leadership that enabled them to conduct successful offensive operations against forces loyal to Huasca. The veteran commanders who served under Atahualpa, including the brilliant General Chalcuchima and the experienced warrior Quizquiz, had developed innovative tactics during campaigns against diverse enemies in the northern provinces. Their forces utilized superior bronze weapons produced in specialized workshops, wore protective clothing adapted from various conquered peoples, and employed coordinated battle formations that maximized the effectiveness of different unit types in specific tactical situations. The southern forces supporting Huasca suffered from divided command structure and inadequate preparation for sustained military operations outside the familiar environment of the Central Highlands. Many of Huasca's supporters were administrators and religious officials whose experience lay in peaceful governance rather than active warfare, while the military units available in the Cusco region had been primarily engaged in ceremonial duties and local security operations, rather than the intensive training and combat experience that characterized northern armies. The demographic losses caused by epidemic diseases had particularly severe effects on these forces, as many experienced officers and specialized personnel had died before the Civil War began. The Battle of Cotabambas marked the first major engagement between the rival armies, demonstrating the tactical superiority of Atahualpa's forces while revealing the devastating impact of European diseases on traditional Inca military organization. Chalcuchima's northern army approached the battlefield with approximately 35,000 warriors organized in decimal units that could maneuver independently while maintaining coordinated tactical formations. The southern forces opposing them numbered roughly 30,000 men, but included many hastily recruited militia units that lacked the training and equipment necessary for effective combat against professional soldiers. The battle began with traditional Inca tactics, involving massed formations of warriors armed with slings, clubs, and bronze-tipped spears, but quickly evolved into a more complex engagement that showcased the tactical innovations developed by northern commanders. Chalcachima employed feigned retreats that drew southern forces into disadvantageous positions where they could be attacked from multiple directions, while specialized units armed with captured Spanish weapons and armor provided tactical advantages that traditional Inca forces could not match. The psychological impact of these foreign weapons and the diseases that had preceded them created panic among southern forces who interpreted their appearance as supernatural omens favouring Atahualpa's cause. The aftermath of Cotabambas revealed the broader implications of the civil war for imperial unity and administrative effectiveness. The defeated southern forces included numerous provincial governors and local administrators whose deaths or capture disrupted governance throughout the Central Highlands, while the destruction of traditional military units eliminated experienced personnel who could not be quickly replaced. The northern victory encouraged defections among neutral provinces whose leaders recognized the shifting balance of power and sought to align themselves with the likely winner before suffering the consequences of backing the losing side. Huascar's response to military defeats involved increasingly desperate measures that further weakened his position while alienating potential supporters throughout the empire. His orders to execute suspected traitors and confiscate property from families with questionable loyalty created an atmosphere of terror in Cusco that drove many nobles to flee the capital or secretly negotiate with Atahualpa's representatives. The systematic destruction of royal mummies, ordered by Huascar in a fit of rage against his rival's ancestors, violated fundamental religious principles and shocked imperial society while demonstrating his growing desperation and loss of political judgment. The desecration of ancestral remains represented perhaps the most destructive aspect of the Civil War's impact on imperial institutions and social cohesion. The royal Panicas had maintained the mummified bodies of previous Sapa Incas for centuries, conducting elaborate ceremonies that preserved the connection between living rulers and their divine predecessors, while legitimizing current political arrangements through ancestral approval. Huascar's destruction of these sacred objects eliminated irreplaceable historical records, while severing the spiritual connections that bound imperial society together, creating a crisis of legitimacy that extended far beyond the immediate military conflict. Atahualpa's armies continued their advance southward through the Central Highlands, systematically reducing fortified positions while incorporating defeated enemies into their expanding military organization. The northern forces demonstrated remarkable discipline in their treatment of conquered populations, offering generous terms to communities that surrendered voluntarily while conducting brutal reprisals against those who resisted. This combination of incentives and threats proved highly effective in encouraging defections from Huascar's cause, as local leaders calculated the costs and benefits of continued resistance against increasingly hopeless odds. The siege of Cusco represented the climactic engagement of the Civil War, with Atahualpa's forces surrounding the imperial capital while conducting psychological warfare designed to encourage surrender without requiring costly urban combat. The northern armies controlled the agricultural terraces and water sources that supplied the city, gradually strangling its population while maintaining constant pressure against defensive positions. The siege lasted several months, during which disease, starvation, and military pressure combined to weaken resistance while creating conditions that favoured negotiated surrender over continued fighting. Huascar's capture during the final assault on Cusco eliminated organised resistance to Atahualpa's claim, while creating new political challenges related to managing a unified empire after years of destructive civil warfare. The defeated emperor's treatment became a crucial test of Atahualpa's political wisdom, as executing his half-brother would eliminate a potential rallying point for future rebellions while potentially alienating supporters who favoured reconciliation over revenge. Atahualpa's decision to keep Huascar alive as a prisoner demonstrated sophisticated political calculation, preserving options for future negotiations while preventing the martyrdom that might have inspired continued resistance. The consolidation of Atahualpa's victory required extensive reconstruction of imperial administrative systems that had been disrupted by years of warfare and epidemic disease. Many provincial governors and local administrators had died during the conflict or fled their positions to avoid persecution, leaving vast territories without effective governance at precisely the moment when strong leadership was most needed. The demographic catastrophe caused by European diseases had eliminated much of the skilled personnel necessary for maintaining complex administrative functions, while the destruction of records and institutional memory during the Civil War had created additional obstacles to effective governance. The integration of northern and southern military forces presented particular challenges, as the victorious armies expected rewards for their service, while the defeated populations required reassurance that they would not suffer systematic persecution under the new regime. Atahualpa's commanders, who had developed personal loyalties to their troops during years of campaigning, possessed independent power bases that could threaten imperial unity if not carefully managed. The distribution of conquered lands, tribute rights, and administrative positions among competing claimants required delicate balancing that satisfied military supporters while maintaining sufficient resources for governing the empire effectively. The impact of the Civil War on imperial economic systems extended far beyond the immediate cost of military campaigns to encompass fundamental disruptions in production, distribution, and storage networks that had sustained the empire for decades. Agricultural areas throughout the Central Highlands had been devastated by military operations that destroyed irrigation systems, killed farm workers, and disrupted seasonal planting cycles essential for maintaining food security. The Mita labor system had been severely compromised by demographic losses and political instability that prevented effective mobilization of workers for essential projects, including road maintenance, construction activities, and resource extraction operations. The storage system that had provided insurance against harvest failures and enabled redistribution of resources during emergencies had been largely destroyed during the Civil War as competing armies consumed accumulated surpluses while preventing normal tribute collection and storage activities. The kolkha facilities throughout the empire stood empty or damaged, their contents exhausted by military consumption and their maintenance personnel dead, fled, or recruited for military service. The restoration of these essential systems would require years of coordinated effort under stable political conditions that did not yet exist when Atahualpa achieved his Pyrrhic victory. The religious implications of the succession crisis and civil war created spiritual uncertainties that challenged fundamental beliefs about imperial legitimacy and cosmic order. The deaths of so many people from mysterious diseases that traditional medicine could not treat or prevent raised questions about the effectiveness of traditional religious practices and the continued favour of supernatural forces that had previously supported Inca expansion and prosperity. The destruction of sacred objects and ceremonial sites during military operations had violated spiritual protocols that maintained harmony between human communities and the supernatural forces governing their environment. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors under Francisco Pizarro in 1532 occurred at precisely the moment when Atahualpa's victory had eliminated organized political opposition, while leaving the empire weakened by years of civil warfare, demographic catastrophe, and institutional disruption. The timing was not coincidental, as Spanish intelligence networks had monitored the Civil War's progress while planning their invasion to take advantage of imperial weakness and political division. The conquistadors encountered an empire that had achieved its greatest territorial extent under Huayna Capac, but had been fundamentally weakened by the succession crisis that followed his death, creating conditions that would facilitate European conquest despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of indigenous populations. The weakened state of Tawantinsuyu, following Atahualpa's costly victory, created unprecedented opportunities for the small band of Spanish conquistadors who landed on the northern coast of Peru in 1532. Francisco Pizarro, a seasoned veteran of previous expeditions to Panama and Colombia, had spent years gathering intelligence about the wealthy empire that lay beyond the coastal mountains, learning of its internal divisions and the devastating effects of European diseases that had preceded his arrival. His force of 168 men, equipped with steel weapons, firearms, and horses unknown to indigenous populations, represented a technologically superior but numerically insignificant threat that could only succeed through careful exploitation of existing political fractures and the psychological advantages provided by their alien appearance and capabilities. Pizarro's initial landing at Tumba revealed the extent of devastation that had swept through the northern provinces during the recent civil war and epidemic outbreaks. The once thriving coastal city showed clear signs of population decline and administrative breakdown, with abandoned buildings, overgrown agricultural terraces, and demoralized inhabitants who offered little resistance to the Spanish advance. The conquistadors encountered scattered groups of imperial officials and military personnel, but these forces lacked coordination and clear command authority in the aftermath of Atahualpa's victory over his half-brother Huascar. The Spanish advance inland toward Cajamarca followed the royal road system that had facilitated Inca administration, but now served the invaders' purposes by providing clear routes through challenging mountain terrain. Pizarro's men marveled at the engineering sophistication of bridges, roadways, and supply stations they encountered, recognizing that they were traversing the infrastructure of a civilization far more complex than anything they had previously experienced in the Americas. The abandoned Tambo way stations provided shelter and supplies while demonstrating the organizational capabilities of the empire they sought to conquer, though many facilities showed signs of recent damage and neglect resulting from years of warfare and administrative disruption. The psychological impact of Spanish horses, firearms, and steel weapons on indigenous populations who had never encountered such technologies created advantages far beyond their practical military value. Indigenous accounts describe the terror inspired by mounted conquistadors, whose horses were initially perceived as single supernatural creatures, combining human intelligence with animal strength and speed. The thunderous noise of harquebus firearms, combined with their ability to kill at distances far exceeding traditional weapons, created panic among warriors accustomed to close-quarters combat with bronze implements and projectile weapons. The superior cutting power of steel swords and armor provided Spanish soldiers with decisive advantages in individual combat, while their metal helmets and breastplates offered protection against indigenous weapons that could not penetrate European defensive equipment. Atahualpa's decision to meet the Spanish at Cajamarca reflected his confidence in his military superiority and his curiosity about these strange foreigners whose arrival had been reported by scouts and administrators throughout the northern provinces. The Inca Emperor commanded an army estimated at between 40,000 and 80,000 warriors, including veteran units that had proven their effectiveness during the recent Civil War campaigns. His camp outside Cajamarca displayed the wealth and organizational sophistication of the empire through elaborate pavilions, ceremonial regalia, and the presence of nobles, administrators, and craftsmen who accompanied the imperial court during its travels. The Spanish reconnaissance of Atahualpa's camp revealed the enormous disparity in numbers while confirming intelligence reports about the empire's wealth and the emperor's absolute authority over his subjects. Pizarro's men observed the disciplined organization of Inca military units, the sophisticated logistics that supplied such a large army, and the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded the emperor's daily activities. The conquistadors also noted the absence of horses, firearms, and steel weapons among their potential enemies, recognizing that their technological advantages might compensate for their overwhelming numerical disadvantage if they could avoid open battle in favour of more favourable tactical situations. The invitation extended to Pizarro for a meeting in Cajamarca's main plaza represented a diplomatic protocol that had served Inca emperors well in dealing with previous foreign contacts, but proved catastrophically inappropriate when applied to Spanish conquistadors whose intentions differed fundamentally from those of traditional indigenous diplomats. Atahualpa's confidence in his personal safety reflected his experience with diplomatic meetings where his divine status and overwhelming military superiority had guaranteed respectful treatment from foreign representatives. The emperor's decision to attend the meeting with minimal military escort demonstrated his failure to understand the revolutionary threat posed by European invaders who recognized no divine authority beyond their own Christian god and Spanish crown. The events of November 16, 1532 in Cajamarca's plaza unfolded with devastating swiftness as Spanish preparations for treachery met Inca expectations of diplomatic ceremony. Atahualpa entered the plaza carried on a golden litter and surrounded by several thousand unarmed nobles, priests and attendants, wearing their finest ceremonial clothing and displaying the wealth of the empire through elaborate gold and silver ornaments. The emperor's retinue included musicians, dancers, and ceremonial guards whose weapons were primarily symbolic rather than functional, reflecting the peaceful intentions that characterized traditional Inca diplomatic protocols. Dominican Friar Vicente de Valverde's approach to Atahualpa with a Bible and crucifix initiated the formal pretext for Spanish aggression through the reading of the Requerimiento, a legal document that demanded submission to Spanish authority and conversion to Christianity. The emperor's examination of the unfamiliar book, followed by his alleged rejection of its contents by throwing it to the ground, provided Pizarro with the justification he needed to signal the attack that had been carefully planned and rehearsed by his men, positioned around the plaza's perimeter. The Spanish assault began with arquebus volleys and cannon fire that created chaos and terror among the densely packed Inca retinue, followed by cavalry charges that cut through the panicked crowd, while Spanish infantry advanced with swords and pikes to prevent escape. The capture of Atahualpa during this carefully orchestrated ambush eliminated organized resistance, while providing Pizarro with the ultimate bargaining chip for controlling the empire without requiring military conquest of its vast territories. The emperor's seizure occurred amid scenes of unprecedented slaughter, as Spanish weapons cut down thousands of unarmed nobles and attendants who had accompanied their ruler to what they expected would be a ceremonial meeting. Contemporary accounts described the plaza flowing with blood, while Spanish soldiers competed to capture gold ornaments and ceremonial objects from the bodies of their victims, demonstrating the material motivations that drove their conquest enterprise. The aftermath of Cajamarca revealed the extent to which Inca political organization depended on the person of the Sapa Inca, whose divine status made his commands absolutely binding on subjects throughout the empire. Atahualpa's captivity created immediate paralysis in imperial administration, as provincial governors, military commanders, and local officials awaited instructions from their imprisoned ruler while avoiding independent actions that might be interpreted as rebellion against imperial authority. The Spanish conquistadors quickly recognized this dependency and exploited it by using Atahualpa as a puppet ruler who could issue commands that maintained administrative continuity while serving Spanish interests. The negotiation of Atahualpa's ransom demonstrated the emperor's sophisticated understanding of Spanish motivations, while revealing the staggering wealth that the Inca Empire had accumulated through centuries of territorial expansion and tribute collection. The emperor's offer to fill a room measuring approximately 17 by 22 feet, with gold objects up to a height he could reach, with his outstretched arm, plus an additional room filled twice with silver, represented an unprecedented concentration of precious metals that exceeded European comprehension of New World wealth. The specific dimensions of this ransom room became legendary in Spanish colonial literature. though archaeological investigations of Cajamarca have failed to definitively identify the exact chamber where these negotiations occurred. The collection of ransom materials required mobilizing the entire imperial administrative system to gather gold and silver objects from temples, palaces, and ceremonial sites throughout Tawantinsuyu. Atahualpa's orders to provincial governors and religious authorities commanded them to strip precious metal decorations from buildings, melt down ceremonial vessels and religious artifacts, and transport the resulting ingots to Cajamarca under Spanish supervision. This systematic looting process destroyed irreplaceable artistic and religious objects that represented centuries of cultural achievement, while demonstrating the Spanish prioritization of material wealth over the cultural and spiritual values that gave these objects meaning within Inca society. The transportation of ransom materials to Cajamarca utilized the same road networks and administrative systems that had previously served imperial governance, but now functioned under Spanish oversight that ensured delivery while preventing organized resistance to the conquest. Llama caravans carrying gold and silver ingots travelled under guard through mountain passes and valley routes, creating a flow of wealth that amazed Spanish observers while representing the systematic dismantling of imperial religious and ceremonial infrastructure. The melting down of elaborate gold work from the Coricancha temple in Cusco alone provided several tons of precious metal, though this process destroyed artistic masterpieces whose cultural value far exceeded their material worth. The accumulation of ransom materials in Cajamarca created logistical challenges that required Spanish adaptation to Inca administrative methods and transportation systems. The conquistadors established workshops where indigenous craftsmen melted down ceremonial objects under Spanish supervision, creating standardized ingots that could be more easily transported and divided among expedition members. The process revealed the sophisticated metallurgical techniques employed by Inca artisans, whose ability to work gold and silver exceeded European capabilities in many technical aspects, though Spanish priorities focused on extracting maximum quantities of raw metal rather than preserving artistic achievements. The completion of ransom collection by mid-1533 provided Pizarro with wealth that exceeded the expectations of even the most optimistic Spanish adventurers, but the emperor's continued captivity revealed Spanish intentions that extended far beyond simple material extraction. The distribution of ransom gold among expedition members created individual fortunes that transformed Spanish colonial society, while providing the financial resources necessary for consolidating conquest through additional military expeditions and administrative infrastructure. The Royal Fifth, reserved for the Spanish crown, represented unprecedented revenue that would finance further colonial expansion throughout the Americas, while demonstrating the material benefits of New World conquest to European monarchs and investors. Atahualpa's execution in July 1533 eliminated the last legitimate source of imperial authority, while creating a power vacuum that Spanish conquistadors sought to fill through puppet rulers and direct military control. The emperor's death by garrote, following his last-minute conversion to Christianity, represented a calculated decision by Pizarro to prevent future indigenous rallying around their captured ruler while avoiding the potential martyrdom that might have resulted from burning him alive as originally planned. The execution shocked indigenous populations throughout the empire, who had expected their emperor's release following completion of the ransom payments, creating widespread disillusionment with Spanish promises and diplomatic agreements. The Spanish march to Cusco following Atahualpa's execution encountered minimal organized resistance as imperial administrative systems collapsed without central authority to coordinate defensive efforts. Provincial governors and military commanders faced impossible choices between futile resistance against technologically superior invaders and collaboration that might preserve their positions under Spanish rule. The conquistadors' advance through the highland valleys revealed the extent of demographic catastrophe caused by European diseases, with abandoned settlements, uncultivated agricultural terraces, and reduced populations that facilitated Spanish movement while demonstrating the biological warfare that had preceded military conquest. The Spanish entry into Cusco in November 1533 provided access to the imperial capital's accumulated wealth, while demonstrating the architectural and artistic achievements of Inca civilization to European observers whose accounts preserve valuable descriptions of the city before systematic Spanish alterations. The conquistadors marvelled at the precision of stone construction, the sophistication of urban planning, and the elaborate decoration of temples and palaces that exceeded anything they had previously encountered in the Americas. The Coricancha temple particularly impressed Spanish observers, whose descriptions of gold-plated walls, life-size golden statues, and elaborate ceremonial objects provide crucial evidence for understanding the material culture of imperial religious practices. The systematic looting of Cusco's temples, palaces, and public buildings provided additional wealth that supplemented the Cajamarca ransom, while destroying the physical infrastructure of imperial religious and ceremonial life. Spanish soldiers stripped gold and silver decorations from building surfaces, melted down ceremonial vessels and religious artifacts, and seized textile masterpieces whose artistic value they could not appreciate but whose precious metal threads provided additional sources of wealth. The destruction of royal mummies during this looting process eliminated irreplaceable historical records while violating fundamental religious principles that had maintained imperial legitimacy for centuries. The installation of Manco Inca as puppet emperor represented Spanish recognition that effective governance required maintaining indigenous administrative systems under European oversight, rather than attempting direct rule over populations whose languages, customs, and territorial organization remained largely incomprehensible to Spanish administrators. Manco Inca, a half-brother of both Huascar and Atahualpa, possessed legitimate claims to imperial authority while lacking the independent power base that might have threatened Spanish control. His coronation in Cusco followed traditional Inca ceremonial protocols that provided symbolic continuity while establishing clear Spanish dominance over imperial institutions. The relationship between Spanish conquistadors and their puppet emperor quickly deteriorated as Manco Inca recognized the extent to which his authority had been compromised and his people subjected to systematic exploitation that violated all traditional concepts of reciprocal obligation between rulers and subjects. Spanish demands for additional tribute payments, forced labour for mining operations, and sexual access to noble women created conditions that no legitimate Inca ruler could accept while maintaining credibility with his subjects. The puppet emperor's growing frustration with his powerless position, combined with Spanish arrogance and brutality toward indigenous populations, created tensions that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The Spanish colonial administration established in Cusco reflected European governmental concepts that conflicted fundamentally with traditional Inca political organization and social relationships. Spanish officials appointed to administrative positions lacked understanding of indigenous languages, customs, and the complex reciprocal obligations that had maintained imperial unity for centuries. Their attempts to extract maximum wealth through tribute demands and forced labour violated traditional limits on imperial authority, while creating hardships that traditional Inca administration had sought to prevent through careful resource management and redistribution systems. The encomienda system implemented throughout former imperial territories granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities and their labour, while theoretically obligating encomenderos to provide religious instruction and protection to their assigned populations. In practice, this system created conditions of virtual slavery that exceeded the most exploitative aspects of traditional Inca tribute obligations, while eliminating the reciprocal benefits that had made imperial rule tolerable for subject populations. The demographic catastrophe caused by continued epidemic outbreaks, combined with brutal working conditions in Spanish mines and agricultural enterprises, created mortality rates that threatened the survival of entire indigenous communities. Manco Inca's rebellion in 1536 represented the last serious attempt to restore independent indigenous rule through military resistance that utilized traditional Inca organizational capabilities while adapting to Spanish military technologies and tactics. The puppet emperor's escape from Spanish custody in Cusco initiated a carefully planned uprising that coordinated simultaneous attacks on Spanish positions throughout the former imperial territory. Indigenous forces that had been secretly assembled and equipped launched coordinated assaults on isolated Spanish settlements while attempting to recapture major administrative centers, including Cusco and Lima. The siege of Cusco during Manco Inca's rebellion demonstrated both the continued military capabilities of indigenous forces and the limitations that prevented them from achieving decisive victory against Spanish defensive positions. Indigenous armies numbering in the tens of thousands surrounded the former imperial capital, while conducting systematic attacks against Spanish fortifications and attempting to starve out the conquistadors through prolonged siege warfare. The rebels utilized traditional Inca military organization and tactics while incorporating captured Spanish weapons and horses that provided limited technological advantages against their former masters. The Spanish defense of Cusco relied heavily on their control of Sacsayhuaman fortress, whose massive stone walls provided defensive advantages that indigenous forces could not overcome despite their overwhelming numerical superiority. The fortress's elevated position overlooking the city enabled Spanish artillery and harquebus fire to dominate the surrounding area while preventing indigenous forces from establishing secure positions for sustained siege operations. The battle for Sacsayhuaman became the decisive engagement of the rebellion, with indigenous forces launching desperate assaults against Spanish positions while suffering enormous casualties from European weapons fired from protected defensive positions. The failure to recapture Cusco marked the beginning of Manco Inca's strategic withdrawal to the remote Vilcabamba region, where mountainous terrain and dense vegetation provided natural defensive advantages that enabled continued resistance against Spanish pursuit. The establishment of the Neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba represented a remarkable adaptation to changed circumstances that preserved essential elements of imperial organization while accommodating the realities of Spanish colonial dominance over most former imperial territories. This reduced but independent Inca kingdom maintained traditional administrative systems, religious practices, and cultural institutions, while serving as a refuge for indigenous populations fleeing Spanish exploitation. The Vilcabamba stronghold occupied a strategic position in the eastern slopes of the Andes, where cloud forests and steep mountain terrain created natural barriers against Spanish military expeditions, while providing access to resources necessary for maintaining an independent political entity. The region's isolation enabled Manco Inca and his successors to establish agricultural systems, craft production facilities, and administrative centers that functioned according to traditional Inca principles while remaining beyond effective Spanish control. Archaeological investigations of Vilcabamba sites have revealed sophisticated urban planning and architectural achievements that demonstrate the continued vitality of indigenous civilization despite military defeats and territorial losses. The Neo-Inca state's survival for nearly 4 decades after the Spanish conquest of Cusco represented a remarkable achievement that required constant adaptation to changing military and political circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity and indigenous identity. Manco Inca's successors, including Ceque Tupac, Titu Cusi Yupanqui, and finally Tupac Amaru I, faced the ongoing challenge of preserving independence while managing relationships with Spanish colonial authorities who alternated between military pressure and diplomatic overtures designed to secure peaceful submission. The kingdom's diplomatic correspondence with Spanish officials, preserved in colonial archives, reveals sophisticated political strategies that sought to maintain autonomy while avoiding provocations that might justify massive military intervention. The final Spanish assault on Vilcabamba in 1572 represented the culmination of decades of colonial pressure and the determination of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo to eliminate the last independent indigenous political entity that challenged Spanish authority in the former Inca Empire. The military expedition that penetrated the Vilcabamba stronghold utilized improved tactics, better knowledge of local terrain, and indigenous auxiliaries, who provided crucial intelligence about defensive positions and supply routes. The capture of Tupac Amaru marked the end of organized indigenous resistance, while providing Spanish authorities with the symbolic victory they needed to demonstrate complete control over former imperial territories. The execution of Tupac Amaru I in Cusco's main plaza marked not the end of Inca civilization, but rather its transformation into new forms of cultural expression and resistance that would persist throughout the colonial period and into the modern era. The Spanish colonial system, despite its systematic efforts to eradicate indigenous political structures and religious practices, inadvertently preserved many fundamental aspects of Inca social organization through its reliance on existing administrative networks and community structures that proved too valuable to completely destroy. The colonial administration's need to extract tribute and organize labor for mining operations required maintaining the Ayllu kinship groups that had formed the basic units of imperial society, though these communities now operated under Spanish oversight rather than traditional Inca authority. The survival of Ayllu communities throughout the colonial period represented one of the most significant continuities between the imperial era and Spanish rule, as these kinship-based organizations adapted their traditional functions to meet colonial demands while preserving essential cultural practices and social relationships. Spanish administrators recognized that the Ayllu system provided the most efficient mechanism for organizing indigenous labor and collecting tribute payments, leading them to formally incorporate these communities into colonial administrative structures through the reduction program that concentrated scattered populations into designated settlements. These colonial towns, while designed to facilitate Spanish control and Christian evangelization, often maintained traditional leadership patterns and decision-making processes that preserved indigenous autonomy within the constraints of colonial rule. The persistence of Quechua language throughout the former imperial territories demonstrated the deep cultural roots that Spanish colonization could not easily eliminate, despite systematic efforts to promote Spanish as the language of administration, commerce, and religious instruction. Colonial missionaries initially learned Quechua to facilitate Christian conversion efforts, inadvertently preserving and standardizing the language through the creation of dictionaries, grammars, and religious texts that documented indigenous linguistic traditions with unprecedented precision. The widespread use of Quechua in colonial churches, markets, and administrative proceedings ensured its continued vitality, while enabling the transmission of traditional knowledge, oral histories, and cultural practices that might otherwise have been lost under Spanish cultural pressure. The adaptation of traditional agricultural practices to colonial economic demands revealed the sophisticated environmental knowledge that had enabled Inca civilization to thrive in challenging Andean conditions, while providing essential resources for Spanish colonial society. Indigenous communities maintained the terraced farming systems, irrigation networks, and crop rotation techniques that had sustained imperial populations, though colonial tribute requirements often forced them to emphasize cash crops and livestock production over traditional subsistence patterns. The continued cultivation of indigenous crops, including potatoes, quinoa, and maize, preserved genetic diversity that would prove crucial for global food security in later centuries. While traditional preservation techniques enabled communities to maintain food stores during periods of economic disruption and natural disasters. The colonial hacienda system that replaced imperial agricultural organization created new forms of exploitation while inadvertently preserving traditional knowledge and practices that Spanish landowners could not replicate without indigenous expertise. Indigenous workers on colonial estates maintained their understanding of local environmental conditions, seasonal patterns, and crop management techniques, while adapting these skills to meet Spanish demands for agricultural products that could be sold in colonial markets or exported to Europe. The persistence of traditional agricultural knowledge enabled indigenous communities to maintain subsistence production alongside colonial cash crops, creating economic strategies that provided some protection against the most exploitative aspects of colonial rule. The role of Inca nobility within colonial society reflected the complex negotiations between Spanish authorities and indigenous elites who possessed the cultural knowledge and social connections necessary for effective colonial administration. Spanish recognition of legitimate Inca descent provided certain privileges, including exemption from tribute payments, the right to bear arms, and preferential treatment in legal proceedings, creating incentives for maintaining genealogical records and cultural traditions that demonstrated noble ancestry. These colonial privileges enabled some indigenous families to preserve wealth, education, and social status while serving as intermediaries between Spanish authorities and indigenous communities that required leadership familiar with both traditional practices and colonial requirements. The most prominent example of indigenous noble adaptation to colonial conditions was the Betanzos family, descendants of Juan de Betanzos, who married an Inca princess and became one of the most important chroniclers of indigenous history and culture. Their colonial manuscripts preserve detailed accounts of imperial organization, religious practices, and historical narratives that would have been lost without their efforts to document traditional knowledge for Spanish audiences. Similar noble families throughout the former empire maintained private archives, oral traditions, and ceremonial objects that preserved essential elements of Inca culture while adapting to colonial social expectations and religious requirements. The participation of indigenous nobles in colonial resistance movements revealed the persistence of political consciousness and cultural identity that transcended the formal structures of Spanish rule. The Great Rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1780 to 1781 drew its leadership primarily from indigenous nobles who claimed descent from imperial rulers, while organizing resistance that combined traditional Inca symbols and rhetoric with contemporary grievances against colonial exploitation. The rebellion's leader, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, adopted the name Tupac Amaru II to emphasize his connection to the last independent Inca emperor, while mobilizing support from indigenous communities that maintained strong cultural memories of imperial greatness and autonomy. The symbolic power of Inca identity during colonial rebellions demonstrated the continued relevance of imperial history and cultural traditions for indigenous populations who viewed Spanish rule as a temporary interruption of their legitimate political heritage. Rebel leaders throughout the colonial period adopted Inca titles, displayed traditional regalia, and conducted ceremonies that recalled imperial religious practices while organizing resistance movements that sought to restore indigenous political authority. These rebellions, though ultimately unsuccessful in achieving their political objectives, preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge that maintained indigenous identity and resistance consciousness throughout the colonial period. The preservation of traditional religious practices within the framework of colonial Christianity created syncretic belief systems that maintained essential elements of Inca cosmology while adapting to Spanish religious requirements. Indigenous communities developed sophisticated strategies for preserving Huasa worship, ancestor veneration, and traditional ceremonial cycles. By incorporating these practices into Catholic festivals and religious observances that satisfied Spanish religious authorities while maintaining spiritual continuity with imperial traditions. The celebration of Corpus Christi in colonial Cusco, for example, incorporated traditional Inca ceremonial elements, including the display of ancestral mummies, the performance of traditional dances, and the offering of indigenous foods that maintained connections to pre-Christian religious practices. The colonial transformation of Inti Raymi into the Christian feast of St. John the Baptist demonstrated the creative adaptation strategies that enabled indigenous communities to preserve essential ceremonial elements while satisfying Spanish religious requirements. The June timing of both celebrations enabled indigenous communities to maintain their traditional winter solstice observances while participating in Catholic religious festivals that Spanish authorities encouraged or required. The persistence of traditional music, dance, and ceremonial foods during these Christian celebrations preserved cultural knowledge and social practices that connected colonial indigenous communities to their imperial heritage. Modern archaeological discoveries have revolutionized understanding of Inca civilization through scientific excavations that reveal the sophistication of imperial engineering, the complexity of social organization, and the extent of cultural achievements that colonial sources often minimized or misrepresented. The scientific study of Machu Picchu, beginning with Hiram Bingham's expeditions in the early 20th century, demonstrated the remarkable preservation of imperial architecture and provided unprecedented insights into Inca construction techniques, urban planning, and ceremonial practices. Subsequent archaeological investigations have revealed that Machu Picchu represented just one example of sophisticated imperial construction. With similar achievements documented at sites throughout the former empire that showcase the breadth and consistency of Inca architectural traditions. The application of modern scientific techniques to Inca archaeological sites has revealed previously unknown aspects of imperial civilization, including sophisticated metallurgy, advanced agricultural techniques, and complex astronomical knowledge that exceeded European capabilities in many areas. Radiocarbon dating has provided precise chronologies for imperial expansion and construction projects, while chemical analysis of artifacts has revealed trade networks that connected the empire with distant regions and demonstrated the sophisticated economic organization that sustained imperial society. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery have identified previously unknown sites and revealed the extent of imperial infrastructure, including roads, agricultural systems, and urban settlements that were abandoned or destroyed during the colonial period. Ongoing excavations throughout Peru continue to reveal new aspects of Inca civilization, while demonstrating the remarkable preservation of archaeological sites in the Andean environment. Recent discoveries at sites including Choqquequirao, Lac Tapata, and numerous locations throughout the Sacred Valley have revealed the density of imperial settlement and the sophistication of regional administrative systems that connected local communities to the broader imperial network. These archaeological investigations have also documented the impact of Spanish conquest through evidence of destruction, abandonment, and cultural disruption that provides material confirmation of the dramatic changes that followed European arrival. The development of community archaeology programs that involve indigenous communities in excavation and interpretation of Inca sites has created new opportunities for cultural preservation and education, while respecting traditional knowledge and spiritual practices associated with ancestral remains and sacred locations. These collaborative approaches recognize that archaeological sites represent living heritage for indigenous communities whose cultural traditions maintain connections to imperial civilization through oral histories, ceremonial practices, and spiritual beliefs that complement scientific investigation. The integration of traditional knowledge with archaeological evidence has enhanced understanding of site functions, construction techniques, and cultural significance while providing indigenous communities with opportunities to share their heritage with broader audiences. Contemporary indigenous movements throughout the Andean region have embraced Inca heritage as a source of cultural identity and political legitimacy, while advocating for indigenous rights, territorial autonomy, and cultural preservation in modern nation-states that often marginalize indigenous populations. The recognition of Quechua as an official language in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador represents a significant achievement for indigenous rights movements that have worked for decades to gain formal recognition for indigenous languages and cultural practices. This official status has enabled the development of bilingual education programs, the publication of literature in Quechua, and the use of indigenous languages in government proceedings and legal documents. The revival of traditional festivals and ceremonial practices in modern Andean communities demonstrates the continued vitality of cultural traditions that have survived centuries of suppression and marginalization while adapting to contemporary social and economic conditions. The modern celebration of Inti Raymi in Cusco attracts thousands of participants and spectators who engage with Inca heritage through elaborate reenactments of imperial ceremonies that combine historical research with traditional knowledge preserved in indigenous communities. These festivals serve multiple functions, including cultural education, tourism promotion, and identity affirmation for indigenous populations, who maintain strong connections to their imperial heritage. The establishment of indigenous political organizations that explicitly reference Inca heritage reflects the continued relevance of imperial history for contemporary indigenous rights movements that seek greater autonomy and cultural recognition within modern nation-states. Organizations such as the Interethnic Association for the Development of the Peruvian Rainforest and the Confederation of Amazonian Nationalities of Ecuador utilize symbols, rhetoric, and organizational principles derived from Inca political traditions while advocating for indigenous territorial rights, environmental protection, and cultural preservation. These movements demonstrate the persistence of indigenous political consciousness and the continued relevance of imperial traditions for contemporary struggles for social justice and cultural survival. The integration of Inca heritage into modern educational curricula throughout the Andean region has created new opportunities for cultural transmission, while challenging historical narratives that minimized indigenous achievements and contributions to regional development. Educational programs that emphasize the sophisticated achievements of Inca civilization, including engineering, agriculture, astronomy, and social organization, provide indigenous students with sources of cultural pride while educating non-indigenous populations about the complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations. These educational initiatives often incorporate traditional knowledge holders and community elders who preserve oral histories and cultural practices that complement formal academic instruction. The development of cultural tourism focused on Inca heritage has created economic opportunities for indigenous communities while raising important questions about cultural appropriation, historical accuracy, and the commodification of indigenous traditions. Tourist destinations, including Machu Picchu, the Sacred Valley, and numerous archaeological sites throughout the former empire, attract millions of visitors annually who seek to experience Inca heritage through guided tours, cultural performances, and educational programs. The management of these tourism resources requires balancing economic benefits with cultural preservation and ensuring that indigenous communities participate meaningfully in tourism development, while maintaining control over their cultural heritage and sacred sites. The persistence of traditional knowledge systems in modern Andean communities demonstrates the continued relevance of indigenous environmental management techniques, agricultural practices, and social organization principles that enabled Inca civilization to thrive in challenging environmental conditions. Contemporary research has documented the effectiveness of traditional farming techniques, including terraced agriculture, crop rotation systems, and water management practices that provide sustainable alternatives to industrial agricultural methods while maintaining biodiversity and environmental stability. The recognition of this traditional knowledge by international development organizations and environmental scientists has created new opportunities for indigenous communities to share their expertise while maintaining their cultural traditions and territorial rights. The legacy of Inca civilization extends far beyond the Andean region through the global impact of indigenous crops, technologies, and cultural practices that have influenced human development worldwide. The potato, quinoa, and numerous other Andean crops have become essential components of global food systems, while traditional preservation techniques and agricultural methods continue to provide valuable insights for sustainable development and food security initiatives. The engineering achievements of Inca civilization, including earthquake-resistant construction techniques and sophisticated water management systems, continue to influence modern engineering and architecture while demonstrating the sophisticated technical knowledge that indigenous civilizations developed through centuries of environmental adaptation. The continued vitality of Quechua language and culture throughout the Andean region, despite centuries of suppression and marginalization, represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural persistence and adaptation in human history. Modern Quechua speakers maintain linguistic traditions that connect them directly to imperial civilization, while adapting their language to contemporary needs through the development of technical vocabulary, literary traditions, and digital media that ensure continued relevance for future generations. The preservation and revitalization of Quechua represents not merely linguistic conservation, but the maintenance of distinct worldviews, knowledge systems, and cultural practices that offer valuable alternatives to dominant global cultural patterns. The story of Tawantinsuyu thus continues in the present day through the millions of indigenous people throughout the Americas who maintain cultural connections to imperial traditions while adapting to contemporary challenges and opportunities. The sophisticated achievements of Inca civilization in engineering, agriculture, social organization, and cultural integration provide enduring lessons for modern societies facing similar challenges of environmental management, social inequality, and cultural diversity. The persistence of indigenous communities, languages, and cultural practices throughout the Andean region demonstrates the resilience of human societies and the continued relevance of traditional knowledge systems for addressing contemporary global challenges while maintaining cultural identity and community cohesion across generations of dramatic social and political change.